Part 1. The Morning That Changed Everything. August 24th, 79 AD, Pompeii, Roman Empire. The awakening of a prosperous city. The sun rose as always over the Bay of Naples that morning of August 24th, painting the sky in golden hues that reflected on the calm waters of the Mediterranean. For the 20,000 inhabitants of Pompeii, this would be a day like any other at the height of the Roman summer. The city awakened slowly, with the first solar rays warming the basaltic stones of the paved streets and penetrating through the openings in the atriums of Patrician Domus. Marcus Lucretius Fronto, one of the city's elected duumvirs, was already awake before dawn, as was his custom. At 45 years old, this prosperous wine merchant had built considerable fortune exploiting the fertile vineyards on Vesuvius's slopes. His urban villa on Via dell'Abbondanza boasted exquisite mosaics and frescoes that rivaled those of Rome. That morning, while his slaves prepared the ientaculum, the simple breakfast of bread, cheese, and honey, Marcus contemplated the day's business. He had received a substantial wine order from patrician family in Naples, and the transport preparations needed supervision. Not far away, in Regio 6, Lucius Caesius Secundus opened the heavy wooden doors of his bakery. The aroma of fresh bread already spread to the narrow street, while his slaves fed the ovens with dry wood. Caesius was known throughout Pompeii for his circular loaves, marked with his workshop seal. That morning, he had prepared more than 100 loaves to meet growing demand. The city's prosperity meant that even modest citizens could buy fresh bread daily, a luxury unthinkable in many other parts of the empire. Daily life in motion. As the sun climbed the horizon, Pompeii's streets came alive with energy characteristic of prosperous Roman cities. Merchants arrived early at the market, setting up their wooden stalls under Forum's arcades. Gaius Caesius Barcius, a garum trader, the fermented fish sauce that was Roman's culinary passion, carefully arranged a ceramic amphory. His product was considered among the region's finest, made with fresh fish from the bay and aged in underground caves that maintained ideal temperature. The thermi were already operating at full steam. The hypocausta, the ingenious underground heating system, maintained water at perfect temperatures for morning baths. Citizens of all social classes mingled in the thermal complexes, discussing politics, business, and the latest news from Rome. Water vapor rose from the heated pools, creating an almost mystical atmosphere under vaults decorated with mosaics representing Neptune and other marine deities. Children ran to the paved streets, their joyful shouts echoing between the high walls of Insulae, the apartment buildings housing the working classes. Boys played with metal hoops, rolling them across stones polished by centuries of use. Girls played with wooden and ivory dolls, imitating the domestic rituals they observed in their mothers. For them, the world was safe and predictable, protected by the Pax Romana and prosperity flowing from commercial routes converging on Pompeii. The first ignored signs. Around 9 in the morning, a subtle tremor ran through the city. In houses, some amphorae clinked lightly against walls. In the market, some merchants paused momentarily, looking around with slight concern. But tremors were a constant reality in the Campania region. 17 years earlier, in 62 AD, a more significant earthquake had caused considerable damage. But the city had rebuilt itself with even greater splendor. What modern geologists would recognize as precursor signs of volcanic activity was, for Pompeians, just another familiar inconvenience of life in the empire's most fertile region. Quintus Pompeius, a fabric merchant, didn't even interrupt his negotiation with a client when the ground shook beneath his feet. He was showing rolls of Chinese silk and Egyptian linen, precious merchandise that reached Pompeii through the Mediterranean's complex commercial networks. His shop, located on one of the main streets, boasted exquisite decoration, including wall paintings representing Mercury, the god of commerce, blessing commercial transactions. At Villa dei Papiri, on the city's outskirts, Lucius Calpurnius Piso Caesoninus, member of one of Rome's most illustrious families, supervised his copyist work. His library contained more than 1,000 papyrus rolls with works of Greek philosophy and Latin literature. That morning, his literate slaves worked on reproducing Epicurus' texts, the philosopher whose ideas about the pursuit of happiness and acceptance of mortality had conquered many Roman aristocrats. The irony of this reading choice would only become apparent hours later: the accelerated pace of commerce. Pompeii's amphitheater, the oldest known stone amphitheater in the Roman world, remained silent that morning. Built around 70 BC, it had been the stage for countless gladiatorial games that attracted spectators from the entire region. But the games were temporarily suspended due to disturbances that had occurred some years earlier between Pompeian fans and visitors from Nuceria. The arena's silence contrasted with the growing agitation of commercial streets. At the river port, connected to the sea by a navigable canal, dozens of vessels loaded and unloaded merchandise. Honorary Roman cargo ships brought grains from Egypt, spices from India, rare woods from Gaul, and precious metals from Hispania. Dock workers, many of them slaves and freedmen, moved heavy amphorae under the increasingly intense sun. The port's characteristic odor, a mixture of sea salt, fish, navel tar, and exotic spices, permeated the air. Marcus Halconius Rufus, veteran politician and city benefactor, walked through the streets observing the commercial movement with satisfaction. He had personally financed the construction of several public buildings, including improvements to the theater and baths. His family was one of the city's most respected, and his influence extended to Rome, where he maintained important Senate connections. That morning, he was particularly proud to see how Pompeii had become a prosperous commercial center rivaling Puteoli, the region's great port. Roman engineering and operation. The aqueduct supplying Pompeii functioned perfectly that morning, bringing fresh water from nearby mountains. The distribution system, a marvel of Roman engineering, carried potable water to public fountains, private houses, and commercial establishments. In the streets, marble fountains flowed constantly, providing fresh water for any citizen. The sewage system, equally sophisticated, kept the city clean and healthy, a luxury few cities in the ancient world could afford. Artisan workshops operated at full capacity. Goldsmiths hammered precious metals, creating delicate jewelry for wealthy matrons. Potters molded vases and domestic utensils on their wheels. Painters specialized in mural decoration. The pictors worked on frescoes for a new domus, applying imported pigments that cost fortunes: ultramarine blue from Afghanistan, cinnabar red from Hispania, gold obtained from beaten gold leaves. At Stephanus's Phalonica, one of the city's most important laundries, slaves trampled fabrics in tanks filled with fermented urine, the Roman method for cleaning and bleaching clothes. The process, though malodorous, was effective and necessary in a city where appearance and cleanliness were symbols of social status. Citizens' togas needed to be impeccably white, and women's mantles required special care to maintain their vibrant colors. Signs in the sky. Around 10 o'clock, some more attentive observers noticed a subtle change in the atmosphere. The sky, which had dawned clear and blue, began showing slight haze on the horizon, in Vesuvius's direction. But the mountain had always been a source of fertility for the region. Its slopes were covered with vineyards and olive groves that produced some of the empire's finest wines and oils. Volcanic soil was recognized as the most fertile, which is why the region attracted farmers and merchants from throughout the Mediterranean. Pliny the Elder, admiral of the Roman fleet based at Misenum, was in his villa studying manuscripts on natural history. At 55 years old, he was one of the empire's most respected intellectuals, author of an encyclopedic work attempting to catalog all human knowledge about the natural world. That morning, he worked precisely on a chapter about volcanoes, based on travelers' accounts who had visited Etna in Sicily. He couldn't imagine that in a few hours he would become an eyewitness to a volcanic phenomenon that would surpass all descriptions he had collected: the end of normalcy. At 11:30 in the morning, another tremor, stronger than the previous one, shook Pompeii. This time, some people stopped their activities and looked around with greater concern. In the market, some amphorae toppled and broke, spilling wine and oil on the floor stones. More experienced merchants, who had lived through the 62 AD earthquake, began showing signs of nervousness. But life continued. Children still played, merchants still negotiated, artisans still worked. Confidence in Roman civilization's solidity was such that few could imagine a catastrophe capable of wiping an entire city off the map. Rome had conquered the known world, built roads lasting centuries, erected aqueducts that seemed eternal. The idea that natural forces could destroy this established order was almost unthinkable. New an approach when Pompeii's fate would be sealed forever. In houses, families prepared for prandium, the day's main meal. Slaves prepared elaborate dishes with ingredients imported from throughout the empire. Children ran through domus peristyles, chasing butterflies among ornamental plants. Merchants calculated morning profits and planned afternoon transactions. None of them knew that in a few minutes, their lives would be interrupted forever, preserved in volcanic ash like eternal snapshots of a world about to disappear. The morning that had begun with such promise and prosperity was silently transforming into morning that would change everything, not just for Pompeii, but for all human understanding about civilization's fragility before nature's implacable forces. Part 2, The Roar of the Mountain. 1 p.m., the first hours of the eruption, the moment the earth split open. At precisely 1 o'clock in the afternoon, as the sun reached its zenith over the Bay of Naples, the world as Pompeians knew it came to an abrupt and violent end. The sound that erupted from Mount Vesuvius was unlike anything in human memory, a thunderous roar that seemed to emerge from the very bowels of the earth, reverberating across the fertile plains of Campania with such force that it shattered windows 20 miles away and sent flocks of birds spiraling in panic across the darkening sky. Marcus Lucretius Fronto was in his villa's triclinium, sharing the midday meal with his family and several business associates from Neapolis. The conversation had turned to the morning's minor earthquakes when the ground beneath their feet began to shake with unprecedented violence. Wine cups toppled from the low table, their contents staining the pristine white marble floor. But it was a sound that paralyzed them all, a primordial bellow that seemed to announce the end of the world itself. Through the villa's windows, they watched in stunned disbelief as a familiar silhouette of Vesuvius transformed before their eyes. The mountain that had provided their prosperity, whose fertile slopes nurtured the vineyards that had made Fronto wealthy, was now spitting fire and rock into the heavens. What began as a thin column of smoke quickly swelled into a massive pillar of ash and debris that climbed impossibly high into the afternoon sky, spreading outward like the canopy of a colossal stone pine tree. The pillar of destruction. From his villa in Misenum, 18 miles across the bay, 17-year-old Gaius Plinius Caecilius Secundus, known to history as Pliny the Younger, witnessed the birth of this atmospheric monster with the keen eye of a future historian. Years later, he would write to the historian Tacitus. It resembled a pine tree more than any other, for it shot up to a great height on a sort of trunk and then split off into branches. But in that moment, watching from his uncle's study, the young man could only stare in fascination and growing terror as the column climbed higher than any mountain, higher than the clouds themselves. The eruption column, driven by pressures that had been building for over 1,000 years, rocketed skyward at velocities exceeding 100 meters per second. Within minutes, it had reached the stratosphere, carrying with it millions of tons of pulverized rock, volcanic glass, and superheated gas. The force behind the spectacle was equivalent to the detonation of several atomic bombs every second, though no one in the ancient world possessed any framework for comprehending such power. Pliny the Elder, the renowned naturalist and admiral of the Roman fleet, was also observing the phenomenon from Misenum. His encyclopedic mind immediately recognized this as something extraordinary, far beyond the scope of any volcanic activity described in his natural history. As he watched the column spread and darken the sky, his scholarly excitement battled with his growing alarm for the people living in the shadow of the mountain. Little did he know that his scientific curiosity would soon cost him his life. The rain of stone. By 1:30 p.m., the first pumice stones began falling on Pompeii like hail from hell. These weren't the gentle pebbles one might expect, but chunks of volcanic rock, ranging from the size of grapes to that of a man's fist, heated to temperatures that could sear flesh on contact. They fell with increasing frequency and size, drumming against the clay roof tiles with a sound like thunder that never ended. In the bakery of Lucius Caesius Secundus, customers who had come for their afternoon bread found themselves trapped as pumice stones shattered the wooden shutters and bounced off the stone counters. Caesius herded everyone into the back room, away from the windows. But even there they could hear the relentless patter of volcanic debris accumulating outside. The temperature in the shop began to rise as the hot stones piled against the walls. "It's just another earthquake," Cesius told his frightened customers, trying to maintain calm even as sweat beaded on his forehead. It will pass. But deep in his heart, he knew this was something far worse than any earthquake. The air itself seemed to be burning, and the light filtering through the stone dust was taking on an ominous orange hue. Chaos in the streets. The streets of Pompeii, which only hours before had bustled with normal commercial activity, now erupted into pandemonium. Citizens emerged from their homes and shops, looking up at the darkening sky in bewilderment and terror. The pumice fall was becoming heavier by the minute, and people began running for any available shelter. Some sought refuge in substantial public buildings, the amphitheater, the great theater, the basilica, and the forum. Others remained in their homes, believing the thick walls would protect them. Quintus Pompeius, the fabric merchant, stood in his shop doorway watching his neighbors flee past him with whatever possessions they could carry. Elderly women clutched precious jewelry. Men shouldered grain sacks. Children cried in confusion as their parents shouted instructions over the growing din. The pumice stones were getting larger, some now the size of eggs, leaving dents in the wooden cartwheels and bruising anyone unlucky enough to be caught in the open. Close the shutters. Pompeius shouted to his slave, but even as they struggled to secure the wooden panels, pumice stones crashed through, scattering his precious silks and linens across the floor. The fine dust that accompanied the stones was beginning to coat everything in a gray shroud, turning the vibrant colors of his merchandise into ghostly shadows. The darkness descends. By 2 p.m., the sky over Pompeii had transformed from summer blue to a sickly yellow-gray, and then to an unnatural twilight that made noon feel like dusk. The volcanic column had grown so massive that it blocked the sun entirely, casting the city into a premature and ominous darkness. Street lamps and torches were lit in the middle of the day, their flames flickering eerily through the falling ash and pumice. Marcus Halconius Rufus, the veteran politician, had gathered his household staff in the largest room of his domus, the atrium with its thick walls and sturdy roof. As a man who had served in Germania and witnessed barbarian raids, he tried to impose military discipline on the situation. "We wait it out," he announced to his terrified family and slaves. "These things always pass. The mountain has been quiet for centuries. It will quiet again." But even as he spoke these words of false confidence, Rufus could hear the accumulation of pumice on his roof growing heavier. Each new wave of volcanic debris struck with more force than the last, and he began to worry about the structural integrity of even his well-built home. Through the gaps around the doors, he could see that the pumice was already ankle-deep in his garden, burying his prized rose bushes and fountain. The port's desperate activity. At Pompeii's port, the scene was one of desperate activity as ship captains and dock workers realized the magnitude of the catastrophe unfolding. The harbor, usually calm and orderly, now churned with vessels of every size attempting to escape. Cargo ships abandoned their loads, passenger vessels packed beyond capacity with fleeing citizens, and fishing boats struggled under the weight of refugees who had never set foot on a ship before. Captain Gaius Vestorius Priscus, master of grain transport returning from Alexandria, made a decision that would save dozens of lives. Despite the increasing danger from falling pumice and the growing difficulty of navigation in the ash-darkened bay, he ordered his crew to take on as many refugees as possible. His ship, designed to carry grain, now groaned under the weight of entire families with their hastily gathered possessions. Cast off the lines, Priscus shouted over the noise of the eruption, "We leave now or we don't leave at all." The wisdom of this decision became apparent as they pulled away from the dock. Behind them, larger pumice stones were beginning to crash into the harbor, sending up geysers of steaming water. Some of the smaller boats, overloaded with passengers, were already taking on water as volcanic debris punched holes in their hulls. The scientific observer, from his safe vantage point across the bay, Pliny the Younger continued his careful observation of the phenomenon, taking mental notes that would later become the first detailed scientific account of a volcanic eruption. He watched the column spread and darken, noting how it seemed to pulse and surge with its own internal rhythm. Lightning flashed within the ash cloud, not the familiar lightning of thunderstorms, but an eerie, continuous electrical display caused by the friction of countless particles colliding in the supercharged atmosphere. "Uncle," he called to Pliny the Elder, "the column is changing shape. It's spreading wider at the top, But his uncle was no longer simply observing. The admiral in him had taken over from a naturalist, and he was organizing a rescue mission, ordering ships to be prepared for a dangerous journey across the bay to evacuate survivors. The younger Pliny would later write, "The buildings were now shaking with violent shocks and seemed to rock to and fro as if they were torn from their foundations. Outside, on the other hand, there was a danger of falling pumice stones, even though these were light and porous." His words would become the primary historical record of one of history's most catastrophic natural disasters. The temperature rises. As the afternoon progressed, those trapped in Pompeii began to notice that the air itself was becoming difficult to breathe. The pumice stones, superheated by their violent ejection from the Earth's depths, were raising the ambient temperature throughout the city. What had begun as a pleasant August day was becoming an furnace-like ordeal. In the gladiator barracks near the amphitheater, the fighters, men accustomed to facing death for entertainment, found themselves confronting a foe more terrifying than any wild beast or armed opponent. Celadus, a renowned Thracian gladiator whose victories had made him famous throughout Campania, organized his fellow fighters in an attempt to dig their way out through the accumulating pumice. But the volcanic debris was falling faster than they could clear it, and the rising temperature was sapping their strength. "We face worse odds in the arena," Celadus told his companions, though privately he knew this was unlike any challenge they had ever faced. In the arena, skill and courage could triumph over seemingly impossible circumstances. But against the raw power of nature unleashed, human prowess seemed pitifully inadequate. The city under siege. By 3 p.m., Pompeii was under full siege from a mountain that had once been its benefactor. The pumice fall had intensified to the point where venturing outside meant risking serious injury or death. The stones were now fist-sized and larger, capable of crushing skulls and breaking bones. The accumulation on the streets was already knee-deep in some areas, making movement difficult even for those brave enough to attempt it. The city's infrastructure began to fail under the unprecedented assault. Aqueduct channels, designed to carry water, became clogged with ash and pumice. The beautiful fountains that had been flowing that morning were now silent, their basins filled with gray volcanic debris. The sewage system, marvel of Roman engineering though it was, could not cope with a massive influx of foreign material. In the house of the Vettii, one of Pompeii's most luxurious residences, the wealthy brothers Aulus Vettius Conviva and Aulus Vettius Restitutus had gathered their extended household in the strongest room of their domus. The house's famous erotic frescoes, which had scandalized and delighted visitors for years, now seemed to mock the inhabitants as they huddled together in terror. All their wealth, all their social status, all their connections meant nothing against the indiscriminate fury of Vesuvius. The point of no return. As the sun, invisible now behind the volcanic cloud, began its descent toward evening, it became clear to more perceptive residents of Pompeii that this was not a temporary crisis that would resolve itself by nightfall. The mountain was not quieting. If anything, the eruption seemed to be intensifying. The pumice stones continued to fall with murderous consistency, and the air grew thicker and more difficult to breathe with each passing hour. Those who had initially sought shelter in their homes began to realize that the roofs above their heads were becoming death traps. The accumulated weight of pumice was causing some of the older buildings to groan ominously, and several roofs in the poorer sections of the city had already begun to collapse. The choice was becoming stark: venture out into the deadly rain of volcanic debris, or remain inside and risk being buried alive when the roof gave way. The roar of the mountain continued without pause, a constant reminder that the earth itself had turned against them. In the span of just a few hours, the prosperous Roman city of Pompeii had been transformed from a symbol of civilization's triumph over nature into a desperate battleground where human ingenuity and courage were pitted against forces beyond comprehension or control. The afternoon that had begun with such promise was ending in terror, and the worst was yet to come. Part 3. The Desperate Escape. Afternoon of the 24th. The Impossible Exodus. The Mass Awakening. By 3:30 p.m., as the pumice stones grew larger and the air became increasingly toxic, a collective realization swept through Pompeii like wildfire. Staying meant certain death. The illusion of safety that had kept many citizens sheltering in their homes evaporated as roofs began to sag and crack under the mounting weight of volcanic debris. What had begun as isolated attempts at flight now transformed into a desperate mass exodus of biblical proportions. The trigger came when the roof of the Stabian Baths, one of the city's most robust structures, partially collapsed with a thunderous crash that echoed through the ash-darkened streets. If even that engineering marvel couldn't withstand the assault, what hope did private homes have? Within minutes, doors throughout the city burst open as families made the agonizing decision to abandon everything they had built and flee into the hellscape outside. Marcus Lucretius Fronto stood in his villa's atrium, watching his beautiful home being systematically destroyed by the relentless bombardment. His prized frescoes were already obscured by ash, and chunks of pumice had shattered several of his most valuable amphorae. His wife, Claudia, clutched their young son to her chest, while their teenage daughter wept over a wooden chest containing her dowry jewelry. "We take only what we can carry," Fronto announced, his voice steady despite the chaos around them. "Water skins, food for 3 days, gold coins sewn into our clothing. Everything else stays." As a successful merchant, he understood that material possessions meant nothing if they couldn't survive to enjoy them. But the look of anguish on his family's faces as they abandoned a lifetime of memories was almost unbearable. The clogged arteries of escape. The streets of Pompeii, designed for the orderly flow of commercial traffic and religious processions, became death traps choked with volcanic debris and human desperation. The Via della Bendanza, the city's main thoroughfare, was already knee-deep in pumice by the time the mass exodus began. What should have been a straightforward evacuation route became an obstacle course, where every step forward required tremendous effort and exposed travelers to the deadly rain from above. Gaius Caesius Barcius, the Garum merchant, had loaded his most valuable inventory onto a cart pulled by 2 sturdy mules. The fermented fish sauce that had made him wealthy now seemed like absurd baggage, but he couldn't bring himself to abandon his life's work entirely. His cart, however, became stuck within 50 yards of the shop, its wooden wheels unable to gain purchase in the shifting pumice. Other carts and wagons suffered the same fate, creating a chaotic jam that blocked the street for everyone behind them. "Leave the cart!" shouted Lucius Caesius Secundus, the baker, as he struggled past with his own family. "The roads are impossible." But Barcius couldn't abandon his livelihood so easily. He and his 2 teenage sons worked frantically to dig out the wheels while his wife held a cloth over their infant daughter's face to protect her from the choking ash. It was a decision that would cost them precious time they couldn't afford to lose. Behind them, a growing crowd of evacuees pressed forward, creating dangerous bottlenecks at every obstacle. Elderly citizens, already struggling with the physical demands of walking through the debris, found themselves trampled or pushed aside by younger, stronger refugees. Children became separated from their parents in confusion, their cries lost in cacophony of the eruption and the shouts of desperate adults. The fracturing of families. The chaos of evacuation proved as destructive to family bonds as the volcanic eruption itself. In the supernatural darkness created by the ash cloud, with visibility reduced to mere yards and the constant rain of pumice creating a deafening din, keeping families together became nearly impossible. Quintus Pompeius, the fabric merchant who had spent the morning displaying Chinese silks, now found himself separated from his wife and 3 children somewhere along the Via Stabiana. He had been helping an elderly neighbor when a surge in the crowd swept his family forward while he was left behind. Now, with panic rising in his throat, he fought against the flow of evacuees, calling their names into the ash-filled air. "Julia, Marcus, have you seen my wife, Julia?" he shouted to every passing face. But most people were too focused on their own survival to offer help. The community bonds that had held Pompeian society together for centuries were dissolving in the face of raw survival instinct. Neighbors who had shared meals and celebrated festivals together now pushed past each other without recognition, their faces masked by cloth and distorted by terror. The Halconius family faced their own tragic separation. As one of Pompeii's most prominent political dynasties, they had initially tried to maintain dignity in their evacuation, with slaves carrying sedan chairs for the elderly matriarch. But when a section of building facade collapsed across their path, the family scattered in different directions. Marcus Halconius Rufus found himself with only 2 of his 5 children, while his wife and elderly mother disappeared into gray chaos with the remaining family members and most of their household slaves. The port of despair. The harbor district, usually the most prosperous and well-organized area of Pompeii, had transformed into a scene of absolute pandemonium. Every vessel in port, from massive grain ships to tiny fishing boats, was being pressed into service as an escape route. But the same volcanic forces devastating the city had turned the typically calm bay into a roiling nightmare of superheated water and floating pumice. Captain Gaius Vestorius Priscus, who had made the early decision to evacuate by sea, now watched in horror as the situation deteriorated beyond all reasonable control. His grain ship, designed to carry cargo, was overloaded with nearly 200 refugees, triple its safe passenger capacity. Every inch of deck space was occupied by families clutching whatever possessions they had managed to save. In the hold below, people were packed so tightly that several had already fainted from heat exhaustion and lack of air. "Captain, we cannot take more," his first mate shouted over the din. "The ship will founder." But even as he spoke, more desperate citizens waded into the harbor waters, holding children above their heads and pleading for rescue. The moral calculus was impossible. Save a few more and risk everyone, or leave fellow Romans to certain death. The smaller vessels faced even more harrowing choices. A fishing boat designed for 4 men now carried 23 passengers, riding so low in the water that each wave threatened to swamp entirely. The boat's owner, a weathered fisherman named Gaius Papidius, had tried to refuse additional passengers, but desperate parents had literally thrown their children aboard before swimming after the overloaded craft. The sea turned enemy. The Bay of Naples, which had provided Pompeii with prosperity through centuries of maritime trade, now became another instrument of the mountain's wrath. The massive heat generated by the eruption was causing the seawater to reach near boiling temperatures in some areas. Fish floated dead on the surface, cooked in their own habitat. Steam rose from the waves in ghostly wisps that obscured visibility and made navigation nearly impossible. Worse still, the eruption was generating its own weather systems. Tsunamis triggered by underwater landslides sent walls of superheated water crashing against the harbor walls. These weren't the predictable tidal waves that occasionally struck Mediterranean coasts, but chaotic surges of scalding seawater mixed with pumice and ash that could appear from any direction without warning. The merchant vessel carrying the Lucretius family had managed to clear the harbor just as one of these volcanic tsunamis struck. Marcus Fronto watched in horror as the wave, tall as a 3-story building and glowing with its own hellish light, crashed into dock they had departed from minutes earlier. Dozens of people still waiting for rescue simply vanished, swept away, or boiled alive in the superheated surge. "The gods have abandoned us," whispered his wife Claudia, clutching their children as the ship rode the massive swell. But Fronto, drawing on his merchant's pragmatism, refused to give in to despair. "The gods gave us minds and courage," he replied. "We must use both if we want to see another sunrise." The road to Nuceria. Not everyone attempted to escape by sea. Many Pompeians, particularly those who lived in the city's inland districts, tried to flee overland toward Nuceria, Nola, or other neighboring settlements. But the roads that had once connected Pompeii to the wider Roman world were now treacherous paths through an alien landscape transformed by the continuing eruption. The Via Nuceria, the main road leading southeast from the city, was clogged not only with refugees, but also with steady accumulation of volcanic debris that made travel increasingly difficult. Families who had started the journey on foot found themselves struggling through pumice drifts that reached their waists. Carts and wagons, abandoned when they became unmovable, littered the roadway like the skeletons of some massive battle. Lucius Caesius Secundus, the baker who had urged Barchus to abandon his cart, was making better progress on foot with his wife and 2 young sons. But even traveling light, the journey was becoming a nightmare endurance test. The pumice stones, still hot from their volcanic birth, burned through the soles of their sandals and raised blisters on any exposed skin. The air itself seemed to be on fire, making each breath a painful effort. "Papa, I can't walk anymore," gasped his younger son, a boy of 8 who had been struggling to keep up for over an hour. Caesius looked back toward Pompeii, now invisible in the volcanic haze, then ahead toward the uncertain safety of Nuceria. They had covered perhaps 2 miles in 3 hours. At this rate, they would never reach safety before nightfall, and traveling in darkness through this hell's cape would be suicide. The abandoned and the lost. For every family that managed to begin an evacuation, others found themselves trapped by circumstances beyond their control. The elderly, the sick, and the disabled became the eruption's most helpless victims, often abandoned by their own families who faced a terrible choice between certain death for all or survival for some. In the villa of Diomedes, just outside the city walls, the elderly patriarch Aulus Umbricius Scaurus, one of Pompey's wealthiest garum producers, had refused to leave his home despite his family's pleas. At 72 years old and suffering from severe arthritis, he claimed he would rather die in dignity among his possessions than perish like an animal on the roads. His son and daughter-in-law faced an agonizing decision: stay and die with him, or abandon him to save their own children. "Go!" the old man commanded from his bed, where he lay surrounded by account books and family portraits. "I have lived my life. Your children deserve theirs." It was a scene repeated in dozens of homes throughout the city, as families were forced to make choices that would haunt the survivors for the rest of their lives. The slaves faced perhaps the cruelest fate of all. Those who had served in wealthy households found themselves suddenly freed by the crisis, but freedom meant nothing without the resources to escape. Many chose to remain with their masters' families, preferring familiar bonds to uncertain liberty. Others, freed from all obligations by the breakdown of social order, simply wandered the streets in confusion, unsure whether to flee or seek shelter. The window closing. As the afternoon wore on and the situation continued to deteriorate, it became increasingly clear that the window of opportunity for escape was rapidly closing. The pumice fall showed no signs of abating, and the accumulation on the roads was making travel progressively more difficult. Those who had delayed their departure, hoping the eruption would subside, now found themselves facing impossible conditions. The city gates, designed to regulate the flow of commercial traffic during peaceful times, became bottlenecks of desperation as thousands of citizens tried to squeeze through openings barely wide enough for two carts. The Herculaneum Gate, on the city's northern edge, was completely blocked by a collapsed section of the city wall, forcing evacuees to climb over dangerous rubble piles while pumice stones rained down on them. At the Sarno Gate, leading toward the river port, the situation was even more chaotic. A wagon loaded with a wealthy family's possessions had overturned in the gateway itself, creating an obstruction that trapped hundreds of people inside the city walls. Men worked frantically to clear the wreckage while women and children pressed against them from behind, creating a human crush that killed several people through simple suffocation before they could even attempt to escape the volcanic disaster. The point of no return. By 5 p.m., approximately 4 hours after the eruption began, Pompeii had transformed from a thriving Roman city into a death trap where survival depended more on luck than planning. Those who made early decisions to flee had the best chances, but even they faced mounting dangers as the volcanic assault intensified. The later evacuees found themselves struggling through increasingly difficult conditions with diminishing prospects of success. The air itself had become a toxic mixture of ash, sulfur compounds, and superheated particles that seared the lungs and made extended physical exertion nearly impossible. Many evacuees, already exhausted from fighting through the debris-choked streets, found themselves overcome by respiratory distress and heat exhaustion. Families watched helplessly as loved ones collapsed and couldn't be revived, forced to choose between staying with the fallen or continuing their own desperate flight. The volcanic night was approaching, and with it would come even greater horrors. Those still trapped within Pompeii's walls had perhaps an hour of limited visibility remaining before complete darkness would make movement impossible. The desperate escape that had begun with hope and determination was becoming a race against time that many were destined to lose. The mountain continued its relentless assault, indifferent to human suffering and the dissolution of a civilization that had taken centuries to build. In the span of a single afternoon, the prosperity and order that had defined Roman Pompeii was being erased, replaced by primal chaos where survival became the only law that mattered. Part 4, Herculaneum, the first to fall. Early morning, August 25th, the pyroclastic avalanche. The elegant city's final dawn. As the first gray light of August 25th struggled through the ash-laden atmosphere, Herculaneum presented a stark contrast to the chaos, consuming Pompeii 8 miles to the southeast. While its larger neighbor had endured nearly 18 hours of relentless pumice bombardment, Herculaneum had remained relatively unscathed through the night. A light dusting of ash coated the streets and rooftops, and the occasional pumice stone clattered against the tile roofs. But the city's location northwest of Vesuvius had largely protected it from the worst of the volcanic debris. This geographic fortune had bred a dangerous complacency among Herculaneum's 5,000 residents. Many had spent the night watching the apocalyptic spectacle unfolding across the bay, some even climbing to their rooftops to get a better view of the terrible column of fire and ash that had consumed the sky. The wealthy residents of the sophisticated resort town, many of them Roman patricians who had built elaborate seaside villas here, felt secure in their marble palaces overlooking the Mediterranean. Lucius Calpurnius Piso Cesaninus, the former consul whose Villa dei Papyri housed the ancient world's most extensive private library, stood on his villa's terrace as dawn broke. At 68, he had witnessed the rise and fall of emperors, had debated philosophy with Cicero, and had survived the political upheavals that had transformed the Roman Republic into an empire. The night's volcanic display, while certainly dramatic, seemed like just another spectacle in a life filled with extraordinary events. "The mountain is settling," he observed to his personal secretary, a learned Greek named Philodemus, who had been cataloging the villa's collection of Epicurean texts. "See how the column grows thinner? By evening, this will all be a memory." Below them, slaves tended the villa's elaborate gardens, sweeping ash from the pathways and protecting the delicate plant from the fine gray dust that continued to drift down like snow. The deceptive calm throughout Herculaneum. The morning routine proceeded with an almost surreal normalcy. In the elegant House of the Deer, so named for its beautiful bronze sculptures of stags being attacked by hunting dogs, the wealthy owner Quintus Balbus hosted a gathering of friends who had stayed the night to watch the eruption from a seaside terrace. They reclined on silk-cushioned couches, sipping wine from crystal goblets while slaves served delicacies imported from across the empire. "It's like watching the gods themselves wage war," proclaimed Marcus Nonius Balbus, a prominent magistrate whose family had donated extensively to the city's public buildings. The group had made a party of the catastrophe, treating it as an extraordinary entertainment rather than the disaster it truly was. Their elevated position and wealth had always protected them from the harsh realities faced by common people, and they saw no reason why this should be different. In the city's commercial district, shopkeepers and artisans began their daily routines with cautious optimism. Lucius Mummius Maximus, whose workshop produced some of the finest bronze sculptures in the Roman world, examined his pieces for ash damage. His masterwork, a statue the Emperor Vespasian commissioned for Forum, stood unharmed in the center of his studio, its bronze features gleaming despite the thin coating of volcanic dust. "Just some cleaning needed," he told his chief apprentice, a young man named Gaius who had traveled from Gaul to learn the master's techniques. "We'll have everything back to normal within a few days." Neither man could imagine that within hours, their workshop would be buried under 60 feet of superheated volcanic material, preserving their work for archaeologists to discover nearly 2,000 years later. The mountain's hidden fury. What the residents of Herculaneum could not see from their comfortable vantage point was the deadly transformation taking place high on Vesuvius's slopes. The eruption column that had dominated the sky for nearly a day was beginning to show signs of instability. The massive pillar of ash and gas, which had climbed 30 kilometers into the stratosphere through sheer explosive force, was now struggling to maintain its vertical structure. The physics of the situation were inexorable, though no one in the ancient world understood the scientific principles at work. The eruption column was simply too dense and too tall to sustain itself indefinitely. Like a tower built beyond its structural limits, it was beginning to collapse under its own weight. But this collapse would not be a gentle settling. It would be a catastrophic avalanche of superheated gas and rock traveling at hurricane speeds. High on the mountain slopes, the first signs of column collapse began around 6:30 a.m. A section of the towering ash column, cooled by its journey into the upper atmosphere and loaded beyond capacity with volcanic debris, started to fall back toward Earth. As it descended, it gathered speed and momentum, picking up more material and heating from friction and compression. What began as a relatively small collapse quickly snowballed into a pyroclastic flow, one of nature's most destructive forces. The temperature at the core of this descending avalanche reached 500 degrees Celsius, hot enough to instantly vaporize human tissue and ignite any organic material encountered. The flow moved with the speed and power of an express train, channeled by the mountain's topography, directly toward the elegant resort city that lay unsuspecting in its path. The moment of recognition. At 6:45 a.m., the first observers in Herculaneum noticed something changing about the volcanic column. Instead of rising steadily into the sky, sections of it appeared to be collapsing, creating dark, roiling clouds that raced down the mountain's flanks with terrifying speed. From a distance, it looked almost like a massive waterfall, but this was no gentle cascade. It was an avalanche of death moving at over 100 kilometers per hour. Marcus Crassus Frugi, a Roman senator who had built a magnificent villa on Herculaneum's highest terrace, was among the first to recognize the mortal danger bearing down on them. His military experience in Germania had taught him to read the landscape and anticipate enemy movements, and what he saw approaching triggered every survival instinct he possessed. "Run!" he shouted to his household, his voice carrying across the villa's courtyards and gardens. "Everyone run toward the sea. Now!" But even as he gave the order, Crassus knew in his heart that there was nowhere to run. The pyroclastic flow was moving too fast, covering too wide an area. Still, the Roman in him refused to surrender without a fight. His slaves and family members, trained to obey instantly, began a desperate rush toward the harbor, abandoning everything they owned. But precious seconds had already been lost, and the flow was approaching with the inevitability of a natural law. The distance that should have taken 10 minutes to cover on foot would need to be traversed in less than 2 minutes to have any chance of survival. The harbor's last hope. Herculaneum Small Harbor, usually a peaceful anchorage for fishing boats and pleasure craft, suddenly erupted into frantic activity as hundreds of residents realized simultaneously that their only hope lay in reaching the sea before the pyroclastic flow arrived. The narrow streets leading down to the waterfront became deadly bottlenecks as terrified citizens pushed and fought their way toward the boats. Gaius Petronius, captain of a passenger vessel that regularly carried wealthy Romans between Herculaneum and Naples, was preparing for what he assumed would be a routine evacuation run when he saw the dark cloud racing down the mountain. His experienced sailors, I immediately grasped the physics of the situation. No ship could be loaded and launched before that wall of death reached the harbor. "Cut the lines," he shouted to his crew. "We leave with whoever's aboard now." Only 12 passengers had made it onto his vessel when he gave the order to cast off. Dozens more stood on the dock, reaching toward the departing boat with expressions of desperation that would haunt his nightmares for the rest of his life. In the harbor's ancient boat sheds, built into the cliff face to protect vessels from winter storms, hundreds of residents sought shelter in the stone chambers. These vaulted spaces, designed to house boats, now became impromptu refuges for entire families who believed the thick stone walls might protect them from whatever was descending from the mountain. Marcus Nonius Balbus, the magistrate who had been enjoying wine and conversation just minutes earlier, found himself pressed against the back wall of one boat shed with nearly 50 other people. Children wept in their parents' arms, while elderly citizens gasped in the stifling air. The temperature in the confined space was already rising ominously as the pyroclastic flow approached. The wall of death. At 6:52 a.m., the pyroclastic flow reached Herculaneum's outskirts. What struck the city was not simply hot ash or gas, but a fluid wall of superheated material moving with the force of a freight train and the temperature of a blast furnace. Trees were instantly incinerated, not burned but literally vaporized by the intense heat. Stone buildings, constructed to last for centuries, cracked and crumbled as thermal shock caused massive structural failure. The flow moved through the city like liquid fire, following the natural contours of streets and valleys, but also spilling over buildings and walls with equal ease. It was not simply destructive, it was transformative, changing everything it touched into something entirely different. Organic materials disappeared entirely, while metals melted and stone fractured under thermal stress that no human construction could withstand. In the Villa dei Papyri, Lucius Calpurnius Piso and his secretary Philodemus had perhaps 30 seconds to comprehend their fate before the flow engulfed their magnificent library. The thousands of papyrus scrolls containing the wisdom of ancient philosophers were carbonized instantly, their knowledge preserved only as fragile black cylinders that would puzzle archaeologists for centuries. The two men themselves simply ceased to exist, their atoms scattered into the superheated maelstrom. The House of the Deer, with its beautiful bronze sculptures and elegant frescoes, vanished beneath the flow in seconds. The party guests who had been admiring the volcanic spectacle from the terrace never had time to flee. The deer sculptures themselves, cast in bronze with melting points far below the flow's temperature, liquefied and ran like water across the villa's marble floors. Instant fossilization. The boat sheds that had seemed like refuges became ovens. As the pyroclastic flow poured into the harbor, it filled these stone chambers with superheated gas and ash. The people huddled inside, men, women, children, slaves, and aristocrats alike, died instantly. Their soft tissues vaporized while their bones and teeth were fossilized in place by the intense heat and pressure. Marcus Nonius Balbus, who had donated so generously to Herculaneum's public buildings, was found by archaeologists exactly where he died, his skeletal remains showing him turned toward the harbor entrance, as if still hoping for rescue that would never come. Beside him lay the remains of a young mother clutching an infant, both preserved in their final moment of terror and love. The pyroclastic flow was not just destructive, it was preservative. The intense heat killed everything instantly, but the rapid burial in hot ash and pumice created conditions perfect for fossilization. Unlike Pompeii, where bodies decayed over time leaving hollow spaces, Herculaneum's victims were essentially flash fossilized, their bones preserved in exact positions they held at the moment of death. The sea boils. Even the Mediterranean offered no escape from Vesuvius's fury. As the pyroclastic flow reached the waterfront, it didn't simply stop at the sea's edge. It continued into the water itself, instantly superheating the coastal waters to temperatures that killed marine life for miles around. The few boats that had managed to escape the harbor found themselves navigating through a sea that was literally boiling in places. Captain Gaius Petronius, whose quick thinking had saved his vessel and 12 passengers, watched in horror as the flow struck the water behind them. A massive steam explosion sent superheated vapor hundreds of feet into the air, while the sea itself seemed to burn with an unnatural fire. Fish floated dead on the surface, cooked in their own habitat, while the very air above the water shimmered with deadly heat. The flow's interaction with seawater created its own weather system. Massive clouds of superheated steam rose into the ash-filled sky, creating lightning displays that flickered continuously through the volcanic darkness. The boundary between sea and land, between safety and death, became meaningless as Vesuvius's power extended far beyond the terrestrial realm. The silence after. By 7 a.m., less than 10 minutes after the pyroclastic flow had first struck the city, Herculaneum had ceased to exist. Where moments before there had been elegant villas, busy workshops, and crowded streets, there was now only a gray wasteland of cooling volcanic debris. The flow had filled the ancient city like water filling a bowl, covering everything to depths of 60 feet or more. The silence was profound and eerie. No voices called for help. No animals cried in distress. No flames crackled among ruins. Everything that had lived in Herculaneum was gone, transformed into components of the volcanic flow itself. Even the city's famous bronze statues had melted and flowed away, leaving only strange metallic streaks in the hardening ash. The pyroclastic flow that had consumed Herculaneum was just the first of many that would cascade down Vesuvius's slopes over the next several hours. But none would be more complete in their destruction than this initial avalanche that had wiped away one of the Roman world's most beautiful cities in mere minutes. The ominous precedent. From their position across the bay, observers in Misenum and Naples watched in stunned silence as Herculaneum disappeared beneath the dark flow. Pliny the Younger, still documenting the eruption for posterity, wrote later, "The sight was so terrible that we could not believe our eyes. A city that had existed for centuries simply vanished, as if the earth had opened and swallowed a whole." But the destruction of Herculaneum was more than just a tragedy. It was a warning of what was to come. The same forces that had annihilated the seaside resort were building pressure for even more devastating flows. The elegant city's fate served as a preview of the horrors that would soon engulf its larger, more famous neighbor. As the sun climbed higher in the ash-darkened sky, casting an eerie orange glow of a transformed landscape, the survivors watching from safe distances could only wonder, if Herculaneum could disappear so completely, so suddenly, what hope did any of them have against the mountain's continued fury? The pyroclastic flows had claimed their first victim, but Vesuvius was far from finished. The worst was yet to come, and Pompeii, still struggling under its burden of pumice stones, would soon face the same wall of superheated death that had erased Herculaneum from existence in less time than it takes to draw 10 breaths. Part 5, The Last Night of Pompeii. Dawn of August 25th, the final hours, the unnatural night, as what should have been the dawn of August 25th approached. No sun could penetrate the impenetrable shroud that Vesuvius had wrapped around the Bay of Naples. The volcanic cloud, now 18 hours into its relentless expansion, had transformed day into an alien night more complete than any natural darkness. This was not the gentle blackness of a moonless evening, but an oppressive, suffocating void that seemed to press against the eyes and lungs of malevolent intent. In the streets of Pompeii, the accumulation of pumice had reached catastrophic levels. What had begun as a light patter of stones the previous afternoon had evolved into drifts reaching second-story windows in some areas. The elegant Via dell'Abbondanza, once the commercial heart of the city, was now a canyon carved through volcanic debris, its famous shops and restaurants buried beneath tons of gray pumice that continued to fall with mechanical persistence. Marcus Lucretius Fronto, the wine merchant who had made the agonizing decision to flee his villa the previous afternoon, now found himself trapped with his family in what remained of a collapsed tavern near the amphitheater. Their attempted escape had failed when the roads became impassable, and they had sought shelter in the first building they could find. Now, 12 hours later, that shelter had become a prison of stone and ash. "The roof is sagging," his wife Claudia whispered, her voice barely audible over continuous drumming of pumice on the weakened timber above their heads. Their 2 children, exhausted beyond tears, huddled between their parents in a space that grew smaller with each passing hour as debris filled the room around them. The temperature, which had dropped during the volcanic night, was rising again as the hot stones continued their relentless accumulation. The architecture of death. Throughout Pompeii, the city's famed Roman engineering was failing catastrophically under loads it had never been designed to bear. The flat roofs that had provided pleasant terraces for wealthy families were becoming death traps as they buckled under the accumulated weight of volcanic debris. Each roof collapse sent a tremor through surrounding buildings, creating a domino effect of destruction that spread through entire city blocks. In the House of the Faun, one of Pompeii's most magnificent residences, the family of Lucius Caesius had retreated to the strongest room they could find, the tablinum where the family's patron kept his most important documents and treasures. The walls were thick, the ceiling vaulted and reinforced, and they had believed it would protect them through the volcanic storm. But even Roman construction had its limits. The sound of timber cracking under stress echoed through the house like thunder, punctuated by the crash of falling masonry as sections of the roof gave way. With each collapse, more hot ash and pumice poured into the interior spaces, raising the temperature and making the air increasingly difficult to breathe. "We should have left yesterday," gasped Lucius, fighting back the panic that threatened to overwhelm his rationality. "When the first stones fell, we should have run." But his wife, Claudia, still maintained the stoic dignity expected of a Roman matron. "We are here now," she replied firmly. "We face whatever comes with courage." Their teenage son, Marcus, had been trying to dig a path through the debris blocking their doorway. But for every handful of pumice he cleared, 2 more poured in from above. The mathematics of survival were stark and unforgiving. The volcanic debris was accumulating faster than human effort could clear it. The basement refuges. Across the city, families who had made the seemingly logical decision to seek shelter in underground spaces found themselves in situations that would prove fatal. Basements, wine cellars, and storage rooms that offer protection from falling pumice became death traps as the volcanic debris sealed the entrances and began filtering down through cracks and openings. In the Villa Papyri's wine cellar, a dozen servants and their families had taken refuge among the massive clay amphorae that stored the estate's finest vintages. The thick stone walls and vaulted ceiling had seemed like perfect protection from the chaos above. But as the hours passed, they began to realize their terrible mistake. "The air is getting thick," observed Gaius Papitius, an elderly slave who had served the family for 30 years. The carbon dioxide from their own breathing, combined with toxic gases seeping down from the volcanic debris above, was creating an atmosphere that would slowly poison them all. One by one, the weaker members of their group, the very young and very old, began to lose consciousness as oxygen levels dropped to critical levels. The cellar that had seemed like salvation was becoming a tomb. The servants could hear the muffled sounds of more debris falling above them, sealing their fate more completely with each passing hour. Yet even in their desperation, the social hierarchies of Roman society maintained their grip. The head butler, Lucius Mummius, continued to organize the group and maintain order even as death approached. The poisonous air. Above ground, those who had managed to avoid being trapped in collapsing buildings faced an equally deadly enemy. The air itself. The volcanic ash contained not just pulverized rock, but a cocktail of toxic gases that made each breath a struggle. Sulfur dioxide burned the lungs and throat, while fine glass particles in the ash lacerated the delicate tissues of the respiratory system. Quintus Pompeius, the textile merchant who had become separated from his family during the chaos of evacuation, wandered the debris-choked streets like a ghost. He had wrapped cloth around his face to filter the air, but even this rudimentary protection was failing. Each breath felt like inhaling liquid fire, and his vision was blurred by tears that his body produced in a futile attempt to clear the irritants from his eyes. Julia, Marcus, he continued to call out the names of his wife and children, though his voice was now barely a whisper. The streets he had known intimately for 20 years were unrecognizable canyons of gray debris. Familiar landmarks had vanished beneath the pumice, and the supernatural darkness made navigation impossible. He was lost in his own city, slowly suffocating in air that had become more poison than breath. In the gladiator barracks, the fighters who had initially organized themselves for escape now faced a reality that their legendary strength and courage were useless against an enemy they couldn't fight. Celadus, the Thracian gladiator whose victories had made him a celebrity throughout Campania, sat with his back against a stone wall, conserving what little breathable air remained in their shelter. "We die as we lived," he told his companions, "together as brothers." Around him, the other gladiators nodded in grim acceptance. They had faced death countless times in the arena, but those had been clean deaths, deaths with honor and meaning. This slow suffocation in the darkness felt like a betrayal of everything they had stood for, the desperate final attempts. Even as conditions deteriorated beyond hope, some Pompeians refused to surrender. Small groups of survivors attempted to dig tunnels through the pumice drifts, believing they could create passages to safety. Others tried to climb over the accumulating debris, only to discover that the pumice was still falling, and any path they created would be filled within minutes. Near the Sarno Gate, a group of 20 citizens led by Marcus Halconius Rufus, the veteran politician, had been working through the night to clear a passage through Block Gateway. They took turns digging, spelling each other when exhaustion or the toxic air overcame their efforts. But the physics were against them. For every cubic foot of debris they moved, 3 more fell from above. "We're fighting the mountain itself," gasped one of the younger men, collapsing from exhaustion and respiratory distress. Rufus, drawing on his military experience, tried to maintain morale and organization, but he could see the despair in his companions' eyes. They all understood that they were not escaping. They were simply choosing how to spend their final hours. The most tragic attempts came from parents trying to save their children. Throughout the city, mothers and fathers performed superhuman feats of strength and endurance, trying to dig their families out of collapsing buildings or create shelters that might protect their young ones. But the mountain was implacable, and human love, however fierce, could not alter the laws of physics that govern the volcanic catastrophe. The animals' wisdom, the domestic animals that had shared the Pompeians' lives, showed a wisdom their human companions lacked. Dogs, cats, horses, and even caged birds had fled the city hours before the situation became hopeless, following instincts honed by millions of years of evolution. Those animals that remained were mostly trapped by their human owners' refusal to abandon property and possessions. In the stable behind the house of the Vetii, a dozen horses stood in their stalls, whinnying in distress as hot ash filtered through the roof tiles. The stable master, an old Gallic slave named Brennus, had refused to flee without his animals, and now both man and beast were paying the price for his loyalty. The horses' acute senses detected dangers that humans couldn't perceive: toxic gas concentrations, structural weaknesses in buildings, the subtle changes in air pressure that preceded major roof collapses. "Easy, my beauties," Brennus whispered to the animals, though his own voice was hoarse from breathing the poisonous air. "We'll find a way out." But even as he spoke the words, he knew they were lies. The stable doors were blocked by pumice drifts taller than a man, and the walls were beginning to crack under the weight of debris on the roof. The children's courage. Perhaps the most heartbreaking aspect of Pompeii's final night was the behavior of the city's children. Removed from the adult understanding of their situation's hopelessness, many young Pompeians displayed a courage and resilience that shamed their elders. They comforted younger siblings, helped their parents with impossible tasks, and maintained hope when the adults around them had surrendered to despair. In the basement of a collapsed tavern, 8-year-old Gaius Caesius, son of the baker Lucius, had appointed himself protector of 3 younger children whose parents had died in the building's collapse. With a maturity far beyond his years, he rationed their meager water supply, told stories to distract them from their fear, and assured them that help would come. "My papa is very strong," he told the others, though he hadn't seen his father since the previous afternoon. "He'll dig us out. You'll see." The other children, some barely more than toddlers, clung to his words as their only source of hope in a situation that no child should ever have to endure. The philosophy of the final hours. Among the educated classes of Pompeii, the long night brought reflections on mortality and meaning that would have impressed the greatest philosophers. In the library of Marcus Lucretius Fronto's partially collapsed villa, a small group of scholars and their patrons spent their final hours discussing the nature of fate and the relationship between human civilization and natural forces. Perhaps this is what Seneca meant, reflected Gaius Plinius Secundus, a distant relative of the great naturalist, when he wrote that we are all condemned to death, only the execution date is uncertain. The group had been reading passages from the Stoic philosophers by the flickering light of oil lamps, trying to find meaning and comfort in humanity's greatest thoughts. "The mountain reminds us of our place in the natural order," observed another scholar, though his voice betrayed the fear he was trying to master through philosophical detachment. "We built our city in the shadow of a sleeping giant, and now the giant wakes." But even philosophy had its limits in the face of such overwhelming destruction. As the hours passed and the air grew thicker with toxic gases, the scholarly discussions gave way to more basic human concerns. Final messages to absent loved ones, prayers to whatever gods might still be listening, and simple expressions of love and regret. The sound of ending. Throughout the city, the night was filled with sounds that no human should ever have to hear. The continuous groaning of buildings under impossible stress, the crash of collapsing roofs, the muffled cries of people trapped in spaces that were becoming smaller by the hour. But perhaps most disturbing was a gradual decrease in human voices, as exhaustion, toxic gas, and despair took their toll. Areas that echoed with shouts and calls for help during the early hours of the disaster grew quiet as their inhabitants succumbed to the poisonous atmosphere or were buried beneath collapsing structures. The city that had awakened with 20,000 voices was slowly falling silent, section by section, building by building, room by room. In the Forum, where Roman citizens had debated politics and conducted business for centuries, a handful of survivors huddled beneath the partially collapsed portico. They had given up trying to escape and were simply waiting for the end with whatever dignity they could maintain. The bronze statue of the Emperor Vespasian, erected just months earlier to celebrate his victories, stood partially buried in pumice, its imperial face invisible beneath the gray volcanic debris. The approaching dawn, as what should have been dawn, approached. Though no light penetrated the volcanic shroud, the survivors of Pompeii faced a terrible realization that their situation would not improve with daylight. The pumice continued to fall with mechanical persistence. The air grew more toxic with each passing hour, and the structural collapses that had claimed entire city blocks showed no signs of slowing. Those still conscious enough for a rational thought understood that they were witnessing the end of their world in the most literal sense. The Pompeii they had known, prosperous, bustling, confident in its Roman order, was dying around them, being buried beneath tons of volcanic debris that would preserve it for archaeologists to discover nearly 2 millennia later. But even as hope died, human dignity persisted. Throughout the buried city, Families held each other close. Friends offered comfort to friends, and strangers shared their final rations with anyone in need. The volcanic catastrophe that was destroying their civilization could not touch the essential humanity that defined them as people. The last night of Pompeii was ending, but the city's ordeal was far from over. The pyroclastic flows that had destroyed Herculaneum were building again on Vesuvius's slopes, and soon they would bring a final, merciful end to the suffering of those who had survived the night. The mountain's fury was about to reach its terrible climax. Part 6, the final moment. 6:30 a.m., August 25th. The arrival of the pyroclastic flows. The last warning. At 6:28 a.m. on August 25th, those few Pompeians still conscious enough to observe their surroundings noticed a subtle change in the rhythm of the volcanic assault. The mechanical patter of pumice stones that had drummed against the city for nearly 20 hours faltered, becoming irregular and then stopping altogether. For a brief, impossible moment, an eerie silence settled over the buried city, a silence more ominous than all the previous chaos. Marcus Lucretius Fronto, trapped with his family in the collapsed tavern near the amphitheater, lifted his head at the sudden quiet. Through a gap in the debris that had been their prison for hours, he could see a faint glow in the ash-darkened sky, not from the sun, which remained invisible behind the volcanic cloud, but from something else, something approaching with the inevitability of divine judgment. "Do you hear that?" whispered his wife Claudia, her voice barely audible after hours of breathing the toxic air. But there was nothing to hear, and that absence of sound was more terrifying than all the previous cacophony. It was the silence that precedes an avalanche, the moment of suspended animation before catastrophe strikes with absolute finality. In the gladiator barracks beneath the amphitheater, Celadus the Thracian felt the change in air pressure that his warrior's instincts had been trained to detect. Something massive was approaching. Not an army of men, but a force of nature that dwarfed any enemy he had ever faced in the arena. Around him, his fellow gladiators stirred uneasily. Their bodies responded to signals their minds couldn't yet interpret. The wall of death advances. High on Vesuvius's slopes, the same phenomenon that had destroyed Herculaneum 8 hours earlier was repeating itself with even greater force. The eruption column, weakened by nearly a day of continuous output, was collapsing again. But this time, the pyroclastic flow it generated was larger, faster, and more deadly than any that had preceded it. Fed by the enormous pressure that had been building throughout the night, this avalanche of superheated gas and debris raced down the mountain's southeastern flank directly toward Pompeii. The flow moved at speeds exceeding 120 kilometers per hour, a wall of death over 200 feet high and several miles wide. At its core, temperatures reached 600 degrees Celsius, hot enough to instantly vaporize human tissue and melt copper. This was not the relatively slow suffocation that had claimed most of Herculaneum's victims, but instantaneous annihilation delivered with the speed of an express train. From the partially collapsed watchtower on Pompeii's eastern wall, the guard Gaius Volumnius caught his first glimpse of the approaching horror. What he saw defied description, a roiling wall of fire and ash that filled the entire horizon, moving across the landscape like a tsunami of molten air. Lightning flickered continuously within the flow, creating an apocalyptic light show that illuminated the darkness with hellish brilliance. "Mother of gods," he whispered, though the words were lost in the sudden roar that announced the flow's approach. The sound was indescribable, like 1,000 waterfalls combined with the screaming of 10,000 demons, a noise so profound it seemed to shake the very foundations of the earth. The seconds before impact, in those final moments before the pyroclastic flow struck Pompeii, time seemed to slow to an excruciating crawl. The survivors who were still conscious had perhaps 30 seconds to comprehend their fate. 30 seconds in which a lifetime of memories, regrets, and final thoughts compressed into an eternity of awareness. Lucius Caesius Secundus, the baker who had spent his final night trapped in his own shop, managed to crawl toward his oven where his last batch of bread still sat, now cold and covered with ash. His body, weakened by hours of breathing toxic air, could barely move, but some instinct drove him toward the tools of his trade. He would die as he had lived, a baker surrounded by the fruits of his labor. In the house of the Vettii, the wealthy brothers Aulus Vettius Conviva and Aulus Vettius Restitutus had spent their final hours in the tablinum, surrounded by the account books and business documents that represented their life's work. As the approaching flow's heat began to penetrate even their sturdy walls, they clasped hands in a gesture of brotherhood that transcended all their previous commercial rivalries and personal disputes. Throughout the city, similar scenes of final reconciliation played out in the darkness. Slaves who had served their masters faithfully were embraced as family members. Political rivals who had spent years in bitter opposition offered each other forgiveness. Children who had quarreled with parents sought final moments of love and understanding. The temperature rises. At 6:29 a.m., the pyroclastic flow was still over a mile from Pompeii's walls, but its effects were already being felt throughout the city. The air temperature, which had remained relatively stable through the night, began to climb rapidly as the superheated gas cloud approached. In sealed spaces where survivors had taken refuge, the rising heat created an oven-like environment that made each breath a struggle. Quintus Pompeius, the textile merchant who had spent the night searching for his lost family, finally collapsed near the fountain in the Forum. His body, already weakened by exhaustion and toxic gas inhalation, could no longer cope with the rapidly increasing temperature. As consciousness faded, his final thought was a prayer to whatever gods might still be listening that his wife and children had somehow escaped the city's fate. In the basement wine cellar of the Villa Papyri, the dozen servants who had sought refuge among the amphorae were experiencing their own final moments. The rising temperature was causing the wine in the clay vessels to begin fermenting rapidly, creating an alcoholic vapor that mixed with the toxic gases already poisoning the air. One by one, they lost consciousness, their bodies positioned forever among the containers that had represented their owners' wealth and status. 6:30 a.m. Impact. At precisely 6:30 a.m., the pyroclastic flow struck Pompeii's eastern wall with the force of a nuclear explosion. The impact was not gradual. There was no moment of transition, no period of adjustment. 1 second the city existed, populated by the remnants of its citizenry clinging to life in impossible conditions. The next second, everything changed forever. The flow moved through the city like liquid lightning, following the natural contours of streets and valleys, but also spilling over buildings and walls with fluid grace. It was not simply destructive. It was transformative, changing the fundamental nature of everything it touched. Stone buildings that had stood for centuries were instantly subjected to thermal shock that fractured their foundations. Metal objects melted and flowed like water. Organic materials simply ceased to exist in any recognizable form. Marcus Lucretius Fronto, still conscious in his debris-filled shelter, had perhaps 2 seconds to experience the approach of absolute heat before his nervous system simply shut down. The temperature around him jumped from a barely tolerable 40 degrees Celsius to over 300 degrees in an instant. His last sensation was not pain. The heat was too intense and too sudden for pain, but a strange sense of weightlessness, as if he were dissolving into the superheated air itself. Instant fossilization. The pyroclastic flow that engulfed Pompeii was both destroyer and preserver. The intense heat killed everything it touched instantaneously, but the rapid burial that followed created perfect conditions for preservation. Unlike the slow death by suffocation that had claimed most victims throughout the night, those caught by the flow died so quickly that their bodies maintained their final positions, creating a frozen tableau of the city's last moments. Lucius Caesius Secundus was found exactly where the flow caught him, collapsed beside his oven, one hand reaching toward a bread that would never be eaten. The intense heat had vaporized his soft tissues, but his skeletal remains were perfectly preserved, surrounded by the carbonized loaves that had been his pride and profession. Archaeologists would later count 81 perfectly formed bread rolls in his shop, each one marked with his distinctive seal. In the gladiator barracks, Celadus and his companions met their end in a scene that would have been worthy of the arena itself. The great Thracian fighter was found in a defensive posture, his arms raised as if to ward off an invisible opponent. Beside him lay his fellow gladiators, their remains showing they had faced death with the same courage they had displayed in life. Even in their final moment, they had maintained the discipline and brotherhood that had defined their existence. The family embraces. Throughout Pompeii, the pyroclastic flow preserved countless scenes of human love and devotion that transcended the horror of the moment. In house after house, families were found embracing in their final seconds, parents shielding children, spouses holding each other, siblings offering comfort in humanity's darkest hour. In the House of the Golden Cupids, the family of Gnaeus Papes Habitus was discovered in their triclinium, arranged around their dining table as if sharing one last meal together. The parents sat on either side of their young daughter, their arms forming a protective circle around her small form. The scene spoke of love that persisted even in the face of absolute annihilation. Near the Sarno Gate, Marcus Halconius Rufus and his group of 20 citizens who had spent the night trying to dig their way to freedom were found in a cluster, their remains showing they had drawn together in their final moments. The veteran politician's hand rested on the shoulder of a young man who might have been a son, while around him the other survivors had formed a circle of mutual support that death itself could not break. The artisan's final work. The pyroclastic flow captured not just people, but moments of daily life frozen in time with perfect clarity. Throughout the city's workshops and commercial establishments, artisans were preserved at their final tasks, creating an archaeological record of extraordinary detail and poignancy. In the bronze workshop of Lucius Mummius Maximus, the master craftsman was found collapsed over his workbench, his tools still in his hands. The statue of Emperor Vespasian that he had been commissioned to create for Forum stood nearly complete beside him, a monument to both imperial power and artistic dedication that would outlast the empire itself. At the Phalanca of Stephanus, the workers who had been processing the city's laundry were preserved in various stages of their work. Some were found at the great vats where cloth was cleaned, others at the presses where garments were prepared for return to their owners. The contrast between the mundane nature of their tasks and the cosmic horror of their end created a profound statement about the intersection of ordinary life and extraordinary catastrophe. The animal's fate. The domestic animals that had remained in Pompeii met the same instant fate as their human companions. In the stable behind the house of the Vetii, the dozen horses and their Gallic caretaker Brennus were preserved in a tableau of mutual loyalty. The old slave's remains were found with his arms around the neck of his favorite mare, a gesture of comfort that transcended the species barrier. Guard dogs, chained to their posts and unable to flee, were found throughout the city in positions that showed they had remained faithful to their duties until the very end. Cats, more independent but equally trapped by the circumstances, were discovered in corners and hiding places where they had sought shelter from the increasingly hostile environment. Even caged birds, pets of wealthy families who delighted in their songs, were preserved in their elaborate aviaries. The contrast between their delicate beauty and the violence of their end created some of the most poignant discoveries in the archaeological record. The speed of destruction. The entire process of Pompeii's final destruction took less than 15 minutes from the moment the pyroclastic flow struck the city walls until it completely engulfed every structure and street. This was not the gradual burial that popular imagination often depicts, but rapid and complete transformation that left no time for escape or even comprehension. The flow moved through the city at highway speeds, but its effects were instantaneous. Buildings didn't gradually fill with ash and debris. They were instantly subjected to temperatures that fractured stone and melted metal. People didn't slowly succumb to rising heat. They were killed so quickly that their nervous systems had no time to register pain or even surprise. This speed of destruction was both a mercy and a tragedy. It ended the suffering of those who had endured nearly 20 hours of gradual suffocation and toxic gas poisoning, but also eliminated any possibility of last-minute escape or rescue. The flow was so fast and so complete that it caught even those who had been attempting to flee at the very moment of impact. The silence after. By 6:45 a.m., 15 minutes after the pyroclastic flow had first struck Pompeii's walls, the city had ceased to exist as a living entity. Where moments before there had been the sounds of human struggle, voices calling for help, the crash of collapsing buildings, the cries of trapped animals, there was now only the settling silence of cooling volcanic debris. The flow had not simply buried Pompeii. It had transformed it into something entirely different. The vibrant Roman city with its theaters and forums, its shops and residences, its temples and brothels, had become a gray wasteland covered by meters of volcanic material. Every trace of life had been erased, replaced by an alien landscape that bore no resemblance to the prosperous settlement that had existed just minutes before. The temperature, which had spiked to lethal levels during the flow's passage, began to drop as the superheated gases dissipated. But this cooling brought no relief to anyone. there was no one left to feel relief. The 20,000 people who had awakened in Pompeii on the morning of August 24th, the merchants and artisans, the slaves and citizens, the children and elderly, the rich and poor, all had been reduced to mineral components of the volcanic flow itself. The end of a world. The destruction of Pompeii represented more than just the loss of a single city. It marked the end of a complete world, a self-contained universe of Roman civilization that had taken centuries to develop. The libraries with their scrolls of ancient wisdom, the workshops with their artistic masterpieces, the homes with their family treasures, the temples with their sacred artifacts, all had been transformed into archaeological specimens in a matter of minutes. The pyroclastic flow had accomplished what no army could have achieved, what no natural disaster in human memory had ever managed. It had not simply conquered Pompeii. It had erased it so completely that its very existence would be forgotten for over 1,000 years, until Renaissance scholars began to uncover first traces of the buried city. But in its very destruction, Pompeii achieved a kind of immortality. The same flow that killed every living thing in the city had also preserved it with unprecedented fidelity, creating a time capsule that would allow future generations to witness the final moments of a lost civilization with startling clarity and detail. The prosperous city of 20,000 inhabitants had indeed ceased to exist, but in its death, it had become something far more precious, a perfect window into the past, a testament to both the fragility and the resilience of human civilization in the face of forces beyond comprehension or control. Part 7, Echoes of Destruction. August 25th to 26th, the regional impact, the expanding circle of catastrophe. As the pyroclastic flows completed their deadly work in Pompeii and Herculaneum, Vesuvius was far from finished with its assault on the Roman world. The mountain's fury had claimed its most famous victims, but the eruption's effects rippled outward like stones thrown into a pond, touching every settlement, every farm, every life within a 100-mile radius of the volcanic epicenter. What had begun as a localized disaster was rapidly transforming into a regional catastrophe that would reshape the geography, economy, and very culture of the Campania region. The smaller towns and villas that dotted the fertile landscape around the Bay of Naples, settlements that had prospered in the shadow of the great cities, now found themselves directly in the path of volcanic destruction. These communities, with names like Stabii, Aplantis, and Nuceria, had awakened on August 24th as thriving centers of Roman civilization. By the afternoon of August 25th, they would join Pompeii and Herculaneum in archaeological immortality from his villa in Misenum. Pliny the Younger continued to document the unfolding catastrophe, though his scientific detachment was increasingly strained by the horror of what he witnessed. The destruction spreads like a plague, he would later write to Tacitus. Each hour brings news of another town buried, another harbor choked with ash, another population fled or perished. It is as if the gods had declared war upon our entire region. Stabii, the resort of the elite. Stabii, perched on a cliff overlooking the Bay of Naples, about 4 miles southwest of Pompeii, had long been the chosen retreat of Rome's wealthiest citizens. This elegant resort town boasted some of the most luxurious villas in the empire, sprawling complexes with private beaches, elaborate gardens, and art collections that rivaled those of the capital itself. It was here that wealthy Romans came to escape the heat and chaos of city life, to indulge in philosophical discussions, artistic pursuits, and the refined pleasures that their fortunes could buy. The Villa San Marco, owned by the enormously wealthy Senator Lucius Crassus Tertius, represented the pinnacle of Roman luxury. Its terrace gardens cascaded down the cliff face in a series of marble-lined pools and exotic plantings. The villa's library contained over 800 scrolls, while its private theater could seat 50 guests for intimate performances. On the morning of August 25th, the senator was hosting a gathering of Rome's intellectual elite, including several prominent Stoic philosophers who had come to discuss the nature of fate and human destiny. "Observe how the mountain teaches us about the impermanence of worldly things," remarked Gaius Musonius Rufus, the renowned Stoic teacher, as he watched the volcanic column from the villa's main terrace. His words carried the weight of philosophical tradition, but they would prove more prophetic than even he could have imagined. Within hours, his own physical form would demonstrate the very impermanence he taught, along with the villa's priceless artworks and the assembled gathering of Rome's finest minds. The pyroclastic flows that struck Staby around 7 a.m. moved with the same devastating efficiency that had destroyed the larger cities. But here, the destruction took on an almost artistic quality, as if nature itself was making a statement about the relationship between human achievement and cosmic forces. The Villa San Marco's magnificent frescoes were carbonized in place, creating ghostly shadows on the walls. The bronze sculptures in the gardens melted and flowed like water, creating abstract forms that would puzzle archaeologists for centuries. Senator Crassus and his guests were found in the villa's triclinium, their remains arranged around a table set with gold plates and crystal goblets. They had been sharing one final symposium when death arrived, their philosophical discussions about fate and destiny ending in the most literal demonstration possible of life's fragility. The irony was not lost on later observers. These men who had spent their lives contemplating abstract concepts of mortality had become object lessons in its reality. Aplantis, the industrial heart. 10 miles west of Pompeii lay Aplantis, a bustling commercial center that served as the industrial backbone of the region's prosperity. Unlike the elegant resort towns, Aplantis was a working community where the empire's wealth was actually created. Its workshops produced everything from fine pottery to surgical instruments, while its warehouses stored goods destined for markets throughout the Mediterranean world. The Villa of Poppaea, believed to belong to Emperor Nero's second wife, represented a different aspect of Roman luxury than the philosophical retreats of Stabi. This was wealth displayed for political effect, designed to impress visitors with the power and sophistication of the imperial family. The villa's walls were covered with elaborate frescoes depicting mythological scenes, while its gardens featured mechanical fountains and automated musical devices that demonstrated Roman engineering at its most sophisticated. Marcus Crassus Frugi, the villa's current overseer in Poppaea's absence, had spent the night of August 24th organizing the evacuation of the villa's most precious artifacts. Unlike many of his contemporaries, he had immediately grasped the seriousness of the volcanic threat and had ordered carts loaded with the villa's most valuable possessions. But his preparations proved futile when the pyroclastic flows reached Aplantis at 7:15 a.m. The industrial district of Aplantis provided a unique archaeological record of Roman manufacturing at the moment of catastrophe. In the pottery workshops, half-finished vessels were found still on their wheels, while kilns contained the last firings that would never be completed. The glass-making furnaces, still hot from their own fires when the pyroclastic flow arrived, create a fascinating fusion of volcanic and industrial heat that produced glass formations unlike anything seen before or since. The warehouse district told its own story of interrupted commerce. Amphorae containing wine from Gaul, olive oil from Hispania, and garum from local fisheries were found exactly as they had been stacked by dock workers who would never return to claim their wages. Ship manifests, preserved by carbonization, provided detailed records of trade relationships that spanned the known world, creating an invaluable snapshot of Roman economic networks at their height. The maritime disaster, the Bay of Naples, which had provided the region with prosperity through centuries of maritime trade, became another theater of volcanic destruction as Vesuvius's fury extended far beyond the terrestrial realm. The interaction between the pyroclastic flows and seawater created phenomena that had never been witnessed in human history, turning the Mediterranean's calmest waters into a hellscape of superheated steam and floating debris. Captain Gaius Vestorius Priscus, whose grain ship had successfully evacuated refugees from Pompeii's harbor, found himself navigating through conditions that challenged every skill he had acquired in 30 years of Mediterranean sailing. The sea itself seemed to be boiling in places where pyroclastic flows had poured directly into the water, creating massive columns of steam that rose hundreds of feet into the ash-darkened sky. "The water burns," shouted his first mate, pointing to areas where the sea glowed with an unnatural orange light. Fish floated dead on the surface, cooked in their own habitat, while patches of pumice created floating islands that could hold the hull of any vessel unfortunate enough to strike them. The familiar stars that had guided Mediterranean navigation for millennia were invisible behind the volcanic cloud, forcing ships to navigate by the hellish glow of the eruption itself. The volcanic tsunamis generated by the massive displacement of seawater proved even more deadly than the direct effects of the pyroclastic flows. These waves, some reaching heights of over 50 feet, struck coastal settlements with devastating force. The harbor town of Misenum, despite its distance from the epicenter, suffered severe damage when a series of superheated waves crashed over protective seawalls. Marcus Pliny the Elder, the renowned naturalist and commander of the Roman fleet at Misenum, had launched a rescue mission across the bay in an attempt to evacuate survivors from the affected areas. His scientific curiosity, which had driven him to study volcanic phenomena throughout his career, ultimately proved fatal when his ship was caught in one of these thermal tsunamis. The admiral who had cataloged the natural world in his encyclopedic works became another victim of the very forces he had tried to understand. The agricultural apocalypse, the fertile plain of Campania, which had fed much of the Roman Empire through its abundant harvests, suffered agricultural devastation that would persist for decades. The volcanic ash that had seemed like a minor inconvenience in the eruption's early hours proved to be an agricultural poison that would render vast areas of farmland unusable for years to come. Lucius Spurius Macer, whose estates covered thousands of acres of the region's most productive farmland, watched helplessly as his life's work disappeared beneath layers of gray ash. The vineyards that had produced wine for the imperial table were buried under deposits that reached the height of a man's chest. Olive groves that had been tended by his family for generations vanished entirely. Their ancient trees snapped like twigs under the weight of volcanic debris. The immediate destruction was only the beginning of the agricultural catastrophe. The ash contained chemical compounds that were toxic to plant life, creating a sterile environment where nothing could grow. Even areas that had received only light ashfalls found their soil chemistry altered in ways that would take decades to reverse. The region that had been the empire's breadbasket would require massive investment and years of patient rehabilitation before it could feed its people again. The livestock that had survived the initial ashfall faced a slower, but equally certain death. Cattle and sheep that grazed on ash-contaminated grass developed severe digestive problems that proved universally fatal. Horses, essential for transportation and communication, suffered respiratory damage from breathing the fine volcanic particles. The region's famous breeding programs, which had supplied cavalry mounts and racing horses throughout the empire, were wiped out in a matter of days. The refugee crisis. As news of the catastrophe spread throughout the Roman world, it triggered one of the largest refugee crises in ancient history. Hundreds of thousands of people fled the affected region, carrying whatever possessions they could manage, and leaving behind everything they had built over generations. The roads leading away from the Bay of Naples became rivers of human misery, clogged with families who had lost everything except their lives. The city of Neapolis, modern Naples, initially spared from direct destruction, found itself overwhelmed by wave after wave of refugees. Gaius Septicius Clarus, the city's chief magistrate, struggled to provide food, shelter, and medical care for the masses of displaced people who streamed through the city gates. Temporary camps sprang up outside the city walls, but these quickly became breeding grounds for disease and social unrest. "We have become a city of ghosts," wrote one refugee, a former wine merchant from Pompeii who had lost his entire family in the evacuation. "We walk among the living, but our hearts remain buried beneath the ash with everything we once loved." The psychological trauma of the survivors would prove as lasting as the physical destruction, creating a generation of Romans who had witnessed the end of their world. The economic impact of the refugee crisis extended far beyond the immediate region. These were not simply displaced peasants, but skilled artisans, wealthy merchants, and educated professionals whose sudden departure created gaps in the empire's economic fabric. The loss of Campania's agricultural output, combined with the disruption of its manufacturing and trade networks, sent shockwaves through the Roman economy that would be felt for years. The communications breakdown. The volcanic ash cloud that blanketed the region also disrupted the Roman Empire's sophisticated communication networks. The cursus publicus, the imperial postal system that carried official messages throughout the empire, ground to a halt as roads became impassable and way stations were abandoned. This communications blackout meant that many parts of the empire remained unaware of catastrophe's full scope for weeks after it occurred. Marcus Cocceius Nerva, a senior imperial administrator based in Rome, found himself operating in an information vacuum as reports from Campania became increasingly sporadic and contradictory. Early messages had described localized damage from what seemed to be a routine volcanic event. But as the communications blackout extended into its second week, the horrible truth began to emerge. Entire cities had vanished, along with their populations and everything they had represented. The breakdown in communications also hampered relief efforts. Ships loaded with grain and medical supplies sailed blindly toward destinations that no longer existed, while rescue expeditions found themselves navigating through a transformed landscape where familiar landmarks had disappeared. The Roman Empire's vaunted organizational efficiency, dependent on rapid and reliable communications, proved helpless against the volcanic disruption of its information networks. The environmental transformation. Beyond the immediate human catastrophe, Vesuvius's eruption had permanently altered the environmental landscape of the entire region. The massive quantities of ash and gases ejected into the atmosphere affected weather patterns across the Mediterranean, creating unseasonable cold and crop failures as far away as Egypt and Gaul. The Bay of Naples itself was transformed beyond recognition. Harbors that had hosted merchant fleets were filled with volcanic debris, while entire sections of coastline were buried under pyroclastic deposits. The geography that had shaped human settlement patterns for centuries was rewritten in a matter of hours, creating new landscapes that bore no resemblance to familiar terrain of Roman maps. The ecological disruption extended far beyond the immediate blast zone. Marine ecosystems throughout the bay were devastated by the superheated water and toxic ash, creating dead zones where no fish could survive. Bird migration patterns were disrupted by the persistent ash cloud, while terrestrial wildlife faced starvation as their food sources disappeared beneath the volcanic deposits. The cultural loss. Perhaps the most profound impact of the eruption was the irreplaceable cultural loss it represented. The libraries of Herculaneum and Pompeii had contained scrolls by authors whose works were found nowhere else in the ancient world. Artistic masterpieces that had taken generations to create were destroyed in minutes, representing not just individual tragedies, but the loss of humanity's collective cultural heritage. The Villa of the Papyri alone contained philosophical texts that would have revolutionized modern understanding of ancient thought, had they survived in readable form. The carbonized scrolls, while preserved, proved extremely difficult to unroll and read, meaning that vast quantities of ancient wisdom remained tantalizingly close, but effectively lost to human knowledge. The destruction of these cultural treasures represented more than just the loss of objects. It was a severing of direct connections to the intellectual and artistic traditions that had shaped Roman civilization. Future generations will be forced to rebuild their cultural foundations from whatever fragments survive, creating a permanent gap in the continuity of human knowledge and achievement. The long shadow. As August 26 dawned over a transformed landscape, the full scope of Vesuvius's destruction was becoming clear to the wider Roman world. This was not simply a local disaster that could be contained and overcome through traditional Roman engineering and organization. It was a civilizational catastrophe that had erased centuries of human achievement and left a scar on the landscape that would never fully heal. The echoes of destruction continued to spread outward, touching lives and communities far from the volcanic epicenter. Economic networks built over generations collapsed overnight. Trade relationships that had connected the Mediterranean world were severed. Cultural traditions that had been passed down through family for centuries were lost as their practitioners disappeared beneath the ash. But perhaps most significantly, the eruption had shattered Roman confidence in the permanence of their achievements. The empire that had seemed eternal, built on foundations of stone and law that were designed to last forever, had been reminded of its fundamental vulnerability to forces beyond human control. The psychological impact of this realization would influence Roman thought and culture for generations to come, creating a new awareness of mortality and impermanence that would color the empire's remaining centuries. The regional impact of Vesuvius's eruption extended far beyond the immediate destruction of cities and countryside. It represented a turning point in human understanding of the relationship between civilization and nature, a moment when the limits of human power were demonstrated with devastating clarity. The echoes of that destruction would continue to reverberate through history, reminding future generations of both the fragility and the resilience of human achievement in the face of cosmic forces beyond comprehension or control. Part 8. Rome receives the news. Late August 79 AD, the capital of the empire, The morning sun cast long shadows across the marble columns of the Palatine Hill when the first messenger arrived, his horse lathered with sweat and foam, its flanks heaving from the desperate ride northward. The man stumbled from his mount at the gates of the imperial palace, his toga torn and stained with ash that had traveled hundreds of miles, clinging to fabric and flesh like the memory of horror itself. Palace guards, accustomed to the measured pace of imperial protocol, found themselves confronting something unprecedented. A messenger who spoke not of military victories or administrative reports, but the earth itself turning against Rome. "Vesuvius burns," the messenger gasped, falling to his knees before the Praetorian prefect. "The mountain, it devours everything. Pompeii is gone." Within the marble halls of power, those words would echo like thunder, reverberating through corridors where emperors had once believed themselves masters of the world. For in this moment, barely 2 months into his reign, Titus Flavius Vespasianus, Emperor Titus, would confront a truth that no amount of military might or political cunning could overcome. Nature recognized no empire, acknowledged no Caesar, and bowed to no legion. The young emperor received the news in his private study, surrounded by scrolls containing reports from the far reaches of his domain. At 39, Titus had inherited not just a purple, but the weight of expectations that came with being Vespasian's son. His father had stabilized the empire after the chaos of the year for emperors, had conquered Jerusalem, had brought order to a realm that had teetered on the edge of collapse. Now, as Titus listened to the messenger's account, the mountains splitting open, cities buried beneath rivers of stone, the sky itself falling as ash, he felt the terrible isolation that comes with absolute power facing absolute helplessness. "How many?" he asked, his voice steady despite the tremor that ran through his hands. "We do not know, Caesar. Thousands, perhaps tens of thousands. The reports, they speak of entire populations vanishing beneath the mountain's breath." The emperor stood, pacing to a window that overlooked the Forum Romanum, where citizens went about their daily business in blissful ignorance of catastrophe unfolding to the south. Market vendors hawked their wares, senators debated in the shade of porticos, children played between the monuments to Roman glory. All of it suddenly seemed fragile, temporary, built upon foundations that could crack and crumble without warning. Throughout that first day, more messengers arrived, each bringing fresh testimony to the disaster. A ship captain from Misenum described the sea boiling with pumice stones, waves carrying bodies and debris far from shore. A minor official from Nola told of refugees streaming northward, their faces gray with ash, their eyes hollow with shock. A merchant who had fled into Syria spoke of the sky turning black at midday, of rain that fell like heated gravel, of the very air becoming unbreathable. By evening, the palace buzzed with urgent activity, as the imperial administration struggled to comprehend the scope of the catastrophe. Scribes worked by lamplight, recording testimonies and attempting to compile casualty estimates. Cartographers spread maps across tables, marking the affected regions with trembling hands. Treasury officials calculated the cost of relief efforts, though how does one price the rebuilding of entire cities? The emperor convened his concilium, the advisory council that helped guide imperial policy. In the marble chamber adorned with busts of previous emperors, the most powerful men in the known world gathered to discuss their impotence. Marcus Ulpius Traianus, the future emperor then serving as a young senator, argued for immediate military intervention, as if legions could march against volcanic fire. Others suggested that the disaster might be divine punishment, requiring extensive religious ceremonies and sacrifices to appease angry gods. "We are not dealing with barbarian tribes or rebellious provinces," Titus reminded them, his voice cutting through the debates. "This enemy cannot be negotiated with, cannot be defeated in battle, cannot be bribed or threatened. For the first time in generations, Rome must learn to be humble." The words hung in the air like incense, foreign and uncomfortable to men raised on the certainty of Roman supremacy. The empire had conquered Gaul and Britain, had subjugated Egypt and Syria, had turned the Mediterranean into a Roman lake. Its armies had never met a foe they could not eventually overcome. Its engineers had never encountered an obstacle they could not surmount. Yet here was Vesuvius, indifferent to Roman might, reducing proud cities to archaeological curiosities in the span of hours. As night fell over the capital, refugees began arriving in significant numbers. They came on foot, in wagons, carried on litters, a human tide of displacement that tested the city's capacity for compassion. Families that owned vast estates in Campania now begged for shelter in Roman streets. Senators who had possessed multiple villas found themselves dependent on the charity of friends. Slaves and freedmen, masters and servants, all reduced to the same desperate quality by the mountain's fury. The emperor ordered the opening of public buildings to house refugees, commanded the distribution of grain from imperial stores, and dispatched physicians to tend the injured. Yet even these generous measures felt inadequate against the scale of suffering. How do you console a mother who watched her children disappear beneath a pyroclastic flow? How do you restore hope to a farmer whose fields lie buried beneath 20 feet of ash? How do you rebuild not just homes and businesses, but the fundamental assumption that the world is predictable and secure? In the days that followed, Rome became a city of whisper horrors. Refugees gathered in the Forum Boarium, sharing stories that grew more terrible with each telling. A baker from Pompeii described bread turned to stone in his ovens. A priestess from Herculaneum spoke of sacred flames extinguished by supernatural wind. A child from Stabi drew pictures in the dirt. Crude figures overwhelmed by dark clouds, houses crushed beneath enormous stones. The economic implications quickly became apparent. The Bay of Naples had been one of the empire's most prosperous regions, home to luxury industries that supplied goods throughout the Mediterranean. Part 9, The Silence of the Ruins. The Desert of Ash. 3 weeks had passed since Vesuvius unleashed its fury upon the Bay of Naples, and the mountain still smoldered like a dying torch against the autumn sky. The rescue expeditions that finally reached the devastated region moved through a landscape so utterly transformed that veteran soldiers, accustomed to the aftermath of battles and sieges, stood speechless before the magnitude of nature's violence. Marcus Flavius Secundus, commanding the first organized relief column from Rome, would later describe the approach to what had once been Pompeii. We rode for hours through what our maps told us should have been fertile farmland and bustling villages. Instead, we found ourselves crossing a gray desert that stretched to every horizon. The very air tasted of death and sulfur. Our horses' hooves made no sound in the thick ash that covered the roads we could no longer see, buried beneath layers of volcanic debris that reached as high as a man's chest in some places. The expeditionary force had been hastily assembled when the first fragmentary reports reached Rome. Titus, the emperor's son, had personally commissioned the mission after receiving a desperate message from Pliny the Younger describing the disappearance of entire cities beneath Vesuvius's wrath. What they discovered exceeded their darkest expectations. Where Pompeii had once proudly displayed its prosperity through grand public buildings, elaborate private villas, and bustling commercial districts, the rescuers found only an undulating plain of volcanic pumice and ash. The city's walls, which had withstood barbarian raids and civil wars, were nowhere to be seen. Familiar landmarks, the amphitheater where gladiators had entertained thousands, the forum where merchants had hawked their wares, the temples where citizens had offered sacrifices to gods, all had vanished beneath a blanket of gray death. It was as if the gods had decided to erase human civilization from this place, wrote Gaius Plinius Caecilius, a young engineer accompanying the expedition. We knew we stood above one of Campania's greatest cities, yet we might as well have been exploring the surface of the moon. The silence was absolute. No bird calls, no insect buzzing, no wind stirring through trees that no longer existed. The methodical search. The rescue teams worked systematically, dividing presumed location of Pompeii into grids and beginning the arduous task of excavation. They had brought slaves and freedmen experienced in construction work, along with basic tools for digging. What they lacked was any understanding of the scale of their task. The volcanic deposits in some areas reached depths of nearly 20 feet. As they dug, the first discoveries were not of survivors, but of the city's treasures scattered by the catastrophe. Coins, jewelry, and precious objects emerged from the ash, often still clutched in skeletal hands or scattered near where bodies had fallen. These finds told a story of desperate flight. Citizens had grabbed what they could carry before attempting to escape, only to be overtaken by the mountain's deadly embrace. The work was backbreaking and dangerous. The solidified ash and pumice had formed a concrete-like substance in many places, requiring picks and crowbars to break through. Worse, the diggers never knew when they might break through into a pocket of toxic gas that had been trapped beneath the surface. Several workers collapsed and had to be dragged to safety, gasping and retching from the poisonous fumes that still lingered in the buried spaces. Lucius Valerius Maximus, a freedman who had supervised construction projects in Rome, organized the excavation efforts with military precision. We learned quickly that this was unlike any construction site any of us had experienced, he recorded in his daily reports. The ash had filled every space, rooms, courtyards, even the smallest cracks between stones. It was as if the mountain had deliberately sought to seal away every trace of human life. The emergence of the dead. On the fourth day of excavation, the teams made their first major discovery of human remains. A slave working near what had been the city's northern gate called out in excitement and horror. As his fellow workers rushed to his side, they saw protruding from the hardened ash what appeared to be a human form, but one unlike anything they had ever encountered. The body had not simply been buried. It had been encased in ash that had hardened around it like a sculptor's mold. As the volcanic material was carefully chipped away, the figure that emerged was a perfect cast of a human being in their final moments. The expression of terror was preserved with such clarity that the rescuers could see the person had died with mouth open, gasping for breath that would never come. This first discovery led to many others. As the excavation expanded, the teams began to understand a horrific sequence of events that had unfolded during Pompeii's final hours. The bodies they found told a story of gradual realization, mounting panic, and ultimately futile attempts at escape. Near the harbor, they discovered a family group. Parents and children huddled together, the adults' arms wrapped protectively around the smaller forms. The preservation was so complete that individual fingers could be distinguished, jewelry remained in place, and even fabric patterns were sometimes visible in the hardened ash that had molded itself around clothing. "We found them in every posture of death," reported Marcus Antonius Primus, the expedition's chief physician. Some had died quickly, overcome by the hot gases that preceded the ashfall. Others had clearly struggled longer, found with their hands over their faces, or pressed against walls where they had sought shelter. Most heartbreaking were the children, so many children, found where they had been abandoned or separated from their families in the chaos. The excavators developed a disturbing expertise in reading these ash-preserved tableaus. They could distinguish between those who had died from asphyxiation in the early stages of the eruption and those who had been killed by the pyroclastic flows that followed. They learned to recognize the signs of different types of volcanic death, some swift and merciful, others prolonged and agonizing. Stories from the survivors. As word of the excavation effort spread, survivors from the disaster began to reach the rescue camps. These refugees, who had fled the region in the early hours of the eruption, brought with them stories that helped the rescuers understand the human drama that had played out beneath the ash. Claudia Maxima, a wealthy widow who had escaped Pompeii on the first day, wept as she described the last hours of her city. "I left my house when the first stones began to fall, but so many of my neighbors believed it would pass. They had lived through earth tremors before. We all had. The mountain had shaken our walls many times, and we had grown complacent. Vesuvius is old and tired," they said. "What harm can it do?" She had last seen her brother's family gathered in their courtyard, debating whether to load their wagon and flee. "My brother Marcus kept saying the roads would be crowded, that it was safer to wait in their strong house. His wife was with child and feared the journey. Their 3 young children were frightened by the noise and the falling ash, but Marcus insisted they would be safer at home. I begged him to come with me, but he was the head of the household. He made the decision for all of them." The rescue teams had found that very house and the family within it. They were discovered in the villa's inner garden, where they had sought shelter from the falling debris. The adults were found shielding the children with their own bodies. Their final act won a hopeless protection. Other survivors brought equally tragic accounts. Gaius Flavius Martialis, a merchant who had been traveling to Neapolis when the eruption began, described the chaos on the roads as people fled. The highways became rivers of panic. Carts overturned. Families were separated. Children lost in the crowds. Those who had horses could move faster, but many were on foot, carrying whatever possessions they could manage. The elderly and infirm were left behind. There was no choice. It was save yourself or perish with them. Marcus Publius Rufus, a gladiator trainer who had managed to escape with several of his fighters, provided one of the most detailed accounts of Pompey's final hours. We could see people on rooftops, waving cloths and calling for help as the ash rose around their buildings. Some tried to dig their way out when the fall became too heavy, but it was like trying to swim through liquid stone. The ash was hot. It burned the skin and seared the lungs. Those who breathed too much of it died, choking on their own blood. The fate of Herculaneum. While the excavation of Pompeii revealed the tragedy of a city buried in ash and pumice, the fate of Herculaneum proved even more devastating. The smaller, more prosperous city had been struck first by pyroclastic flows, superheated avalanches of gas, ash, and rock that had moved down the mountain slopes at incredible speed. When the rescue teams finally reached Herculaneum's location, they found not the gradual burial that had characterized Pompeii, but something far worse. The pyroclastic flows had filled the city, like water filling a bowl, but water that burned at temperatures exceeding 1,000 degrees Fahrenheit. The volcanic material had then cooled and hardened into a rock-like substance that encased the entire settlement. Herculaneum simply vanished, reported Quintus Hortensius Hortulus, the engineer leading the excavation effort there. We walked across what appeared to be solid rock, knowing that beneath our feet lay an entire city. Houses, streets, people, all sealed as permanently as if they had been cast in bronze. The pyroclastic flow had moved so quickly that many residents had been killed instantly before they could even react to the danger. The few survivors from Herculaneum who reached the rescue camps told stories of absolute terror. Lucia Antonia, a fisherman's wife, described the moment the pyroclastic flow struck. There was a sound like thunder that never stopped, growing louder and louder. Then we saw it coming down the mountain, a black wall that consumed everything in its path. Trees, buildings, people, all disappeared into that darkness. My husband pushed me and our son toward his boat, screaming at us to run. We reached the water just as the burning cloud reached our house. When I looked back from the boat, our entire neighborhood was gone, not destroyed, just gone, swallowed by that terrible black wave. The economic devastation, the destruction of Pompeii and Herculaneum represented more than just human tragedy. It was an economic catastrophe that reverberated throughout the Roman Empire. Campania had been one of the richest regions in the world, producing wine, olive oil, and grain that fed much of Italy. The volcanic eruption had destroyed not just cities, but the agricultural foundation of an entire region. Titus Flavius Sabinus, the imperial procurator responsible for tax collection in Campania, reported to Rome that the region's annual tribute, normally among the empire's largest sources of revenue, would be reduced to nearly nothing for the foreseeable future. The vineyards that produced our finest wines are buried beneath 20 feet of volcanic rock. The olive groves that supplied oil for half of Italy are gone. The wheat fields that fed our legions are now gray deserts where nothing will grow for generations. The economic impact extended far beyond agriculture. Pompeii had been a major commercial center, its port handling trade from across the Mediterranean. The city's workshops had produced everything from fine jewelry to everyday pottery, employing thousands of artisans whose skills had been passed down through generations. All of this industrial capacity had been obliterated in a single day. Banking houses in Rome faced massive losses, as loans made to Campanian businesses could never be repaid. Shipping companies that had depended on Pompeii's port found themselves forced to reroute their operations to more distant harbors. The price of wine throughout the empire increased dramatically as Campania's vast production disappeared from the market. It was as if someone had struck the empire a blow directly to its purse, observed Marcus Cocceius Nerva, a senator who served on the committee investigating the disaster's economic consequences. We had grown dependent on Campania's wealth without realizing how vulnerable that dependence made us. The mountain's fury reminded us that nature recognizes no property rights, respects no human claims to permanence. The abandonment. As the weeks of excavation continued and the full scope of the disaster became clear, the authorities faced a grim reality. The destroyed cities could not be rebuilt, at least not for the foreseeable future. The volcanic deposits were too deep, the toxic gases too persistent, the risk of future eruptions too great. Emperor Vespasian, already struggling with the cost of completing the Colosseum and other major construction projects, could not justify the enormous expense of excavating and rebuilding entire cities. The decision was made to abandon the buried settlements and relocate the survivors to other parts of the empire. This abandonment marked a turning point in Roman attitudes toward natural disasters. Previous calamities, earthquakes, floods, fires, had been seen as temporary setbacks that could be overcome through human effort and divine favor. The Vesuvius eruption was different. It represented a force so powerful and complete in its destruction that even Roman engineering and determination seemed inadequate to the task of recovery. "We are leaving them to the mountain," wrote Pliny the Younger in a letter to his friend Tacitus. "Pompeii, Herculaneum, Stabii, all the proud cities that once graced this bay. We are abandoning them to their tomb of ash. Future generations may judge us harshly for this decision, but what choice do we have? The mountain has claimed them more completely than any conquering army ever could." The abandonment was not total or immediate. For several years, treasure hunters and former residents continued to dig into the ruins, searching for valuables and personal possessions. The government organized some of these efforts, hoping to recover public funds and valuable artworks for redistribution elsewhere. But as time passed and the volcanic deposits settled and hardened further, even these limited excavations became impractical. By the end of the 1st century, the Bay of Naples region that had once hosted some of the empire's most prosperous cities had become a sparsely populated backwater. Farmers eventually returned to work the outer edges of the volcanic zone. The ash had actually improved soil fertility, but the urban centers were gone forever. Part 10, The Legacy of the Catastrophe, the Moment of Awareness. August 24th, 79 CE, stands as more than just a date of a natural disaster. It represents a fundamental shift in Roman consciousness about the relationship between human civilization and the natural world. Before Vesuvius, Romans had approached nature with the confidence of conquerors. They built their cities where they pleased, diverted rivers to suit their purposes, and generally assumed that human ingenuity and divine favor would protect them from natural threats. The eruption shattered this confidence. For the first time in the empire's history, Romans were forced to confront the reality that there were forces in nature against which their engineering prowess, military might, and political organization were utterly powerless. The mountain had destroyed in hours what generations of Romans had spent centuries building. Marcus Fabius Quintilianus, the renowned rhetorician who lived through disaster, captured this shift in perspective in his writings. "We who believe ourselves masters of the world discovered on that terrible day that we are merely tenants, subject to eviction without notice by landlords we cannot see, cannot fight, cannot negotiate with." The mountain spoke in a voice that reduced all human authority to whispered pleading. This new awareness permeated Roman thought in ways both subtle and profound. Philosophers began to write more frequently about the transience of human achievement and the futility of excessive pride. Architects started to consider natural disasters as factors in their designs, not just aesthetic and functional concerns. Even military planners began to think about how natural catastrophes might affect their strategic calculations. The psychological impact was perhaps most evident in the religious sphere. While Romans had always acknowledged the power of the gods, they had generally seen divine intervention as something that could be influenced through proper rituals and offerings. Vesuvius seemed to represent a different kind of divine power, one that was utterly indifferent to human prayers and sacrifices. Our ancestors believed they could bargain with the gods, observed Gaius Suetonius Tranquillus, the historian. They offered gifts, built temples, performed elaborate ceremonies, all in the belief that divine favor could be purchased or earned. But what gift could have satisfied the fury we witnessed? What temple could have been grand enough to appease such wrath? The mountain taught us that some forces exist beyond the reach of human influence. Architectural innovations, the destruction of Pompeii and Herculaneum, prompted immediate changes in Roman building practices. Architects who had previously concentrated on grandeur and beauty were forced to consider survival as a primary design criterion. The lessons learned from examining the buried cities influenced construction throughout the empire for generations to come. Apollodorus of Damascus, the master architect responsible for Trajan's Forum and the Pantheon, conducted a thorough study of how different building techniques had performed during the eruption. His findings, preserved in technical manuals that were copied throughout the empire, established new standards for construction in areas subject to natural disasters. We learned that height was fatal. Apollodorus wrote in his treatise, De Architectura Post Vesuvium, on architecture after Vesuvius. The tallest buildings in Pompeii became death traps, their upper floors impossible to escape from as ash accumulated around their foundations. But we also discovered that certain construction techniques provided better protection than others. Buildings with reinforced basements, multiple exits, and flat roofs for emergency egress saved more lives than conventional designs. The most significant architectural innovation inspired by Vesuvius was the development of what Romans called refugia, reinforced safe rooms built into public buildings and private homes. These spaces, typically located in basements or ground floors, were designed to provide temporary shelter during natural disasters. They featured independent air supplies, stored food and water, and reinforced construction capable of withstanding significant structural loads. The concept spread rapidly throughout the empire, particularly in regions prone to earthquakes or other natural disasters. Within a decade of the eruption, major cities throughout the Mediterranean were requiring refugia in all new public buildings and encouraging their inclusion in private construction. Roman engineers also developed new techniques for rapid evacuation. The narrow streets that had trapped so many victims in Pompeii led to revised urban planning standards that mandated wider thoroughfares and multiple exit routes from densely populated areas. The port cities of the empire were redesigned with evacuation priorities in mind, ensuring that harbors could handle sudden influxes of refugees. We learned to build not just for normal times, but for the worst times, explained Lucius Nerva Traianus, an engineer who worked on reconstruction projects throughout the empire. Every structure had to answer the question: if disaster strikes, will this building save lives or claim them? It was a revolution in how we thought about the relationship between human habitation and the hostile forces of nature. Urban planning reforms. The disaster prompted equally significant changes in urban planning philosophy. Roman city planners had traditionally focused on efficiency, beauty, and the projection of imperial power. Streets were laid out in regular grids. Public buildings were positioned for maximum visual impact, and residential areas were organized primarily according to social class. Vesuvius forced planners to add a new criterion: survivability. Cities needed to be designed not just for daily life, but for emergency evacuation. This requirement led to fundamental changes in how Romans thought about urban space. The most immediate reform was the establishment of evacuation routes in all major cities. These were wide streets or pathways that connected residential areas directly to city gates or harbor facilities. Unlike normal streets, evacuation routes could not be blocked by market stalls, construction projects, or other temporary obstacles. They were maintained by the government and kept clear at all times. Gaius Julius Frontinus, the urban prefect responsible for implementing these changes in Rome itself, described the challenge. We had to reimagine the city as a living organism capable of rapidly expelling its population when threatened. This meant not just building new routes, but changing how Romans thought about public space. Streets were no longer just pathways for normal commerce. They were potential lifelines that had to be preserved and protected. Public buildings were redesigned with evacuation in mind. Theaters, which had proven to be death traps during the eruption when panicked crowds blocked narrow exits, were required to have multiple wide exits and clear sight lines to emergency routes. Bathhouses, markets, and other gathering places received similar treatment. The reforms extended to residential planning as well. The insulae apartment buildings that housed much of Rome's population were redesigned with wider staircases, additional exits, and communal assembly areas where residents could gather during emergencies. Wealthy private homes were encouraged to include guest accommodations that could house refugees during disasters. Perhaps most importantly, Roman planners began to consider the placement of entire cities in relation to natural hazards. New settlements were surveyed not just for access to water, trade routes, and agricultural land, but for their vulnerability to earthquakes, floods, and volcanic activity. This marked a fundamental shift from the traditional Roman approach of conquering geography through engineering to working with natural constraints, the birth of natural science. The most enduring legacy of the Vesuvius eruption may have been its contribution to the development of natural science. Pliny the Younger's detailed letters describing the disaster represented something entirely new in Roman literature, a systematic, observational account of natural phenomena written with scientific rather than literary or rhetorical intent. These letters, preserved and widely copied throughout the empire, established a new genre of writing that combined careful observation with analytical thinking. Pliny's descriptions of the eruption's different phases, the behavior of volcanic gases, and the effects of ashfall on human health provided a template for future natural philosophers. My uncle's death was not in vain if it teaches us to understand the forces that killed him, Pliny wrote to Tacitus. I have tried to record not just what happened, but how it happened, the sequence of events, the physical signs that preceded each phase, the way different materials behaved under extreme conditions. Perhaps future generations can use this knowledge to save lives where we could not. The letters inspired other Romans to adopt similar approaches to natural phenomena. Seneca the Younger, the Stoic philosopher, had already begun systematic observations of earthquakes and weather patterns before Vesuvius erupted. After reading Pliny's accounts, he expanded his work and encouraged others to contribute their own observations. This movement toward systematic observation and recording of natural events laid the groundwork for what would eventually become modern scientific method. Roman natural philosophers began to distinguish between supernatural explanations for natural events and explanations based on observable physical processes. Marcus Manilius, an astronomer and poet, wrote in the years following the eruption, "The mountains spoke to us in the language of nature, not of gods. If we learn and understand this language, to read the signs in earth and sky and sea, we may yet find ways to protect ourselves from nature's fury without depending solely on divine mercy." The influence extended beyond pure observation to practical application. Roman engineers began to study the mechanics of structural failure, leading to improvements in earthquake-resistant construction. Physicians examined the health effects of volcanic gases, developing treatments for respiratory injuries that proved useful in other contexts. Agriculturalists studied how volcanic ash affected soil fertility, leading to innovations in farming techniques. Literary and philosophical impact. The eruption of Vesuvius profoundly influenced Roman literature and philosophy, inspiring new genres of writing and new schools of thought about humanity's place in the natural world. The disaster provided writers with a powerful metaphor for the fragility of human achievement and the unpredictability of fate. Martial, the master of epigram, captured the transformation of the landscape in verses that circulated throughout the empire. Here where Bacchus once crowned the hills with green vines, here where noble grape juice filled the vats to overflowing, now flames have drunk more deeply than any wine god ever could. Would that mountains had never been given such power, or that gods had never allowed such thirst. The Stoic philosophers found in Vesuvius a perfect illustration of their teachings about the need to accept what cannot be changed while working diligently on what can be influenced. Epictetus, teaching in his school at Nicopolis, used the disaster as a frequent example in his lectures. The mountain's fury was not within human control. This we must accept. But how humans responded to that fury, how they help one another or fail to help, how they face death with courage or cower in despair, these things remain within the sphere of human choice. The eruption also inspired a new genre of disaster literature that combined factual reporting with moral reflection. These works, written by survivors and observers, examined not just the physical events, but their psychological and spiritual implications. They asked difficult questions about divine justice, human responsibility, and the meaning of suffering. Tacitus, in his later historical works, used Vesuvius as a touchstone for discussing the relationship between natural forces and political power. He argued that the disaster had revealed the limitations of imperial authority in a way that no military defeat or political crisis could. Caesar's power extended to the edges of the known world, but it could not extend 1 foot into the mountain's fire. In this, nature reminded Rome that there are kingdoms beyond the reach of even the mightiest emperor. The philosophical implications extended to questions about knowledge and certainty. If a mountain that had been dormant for centuries could suddenly destroy entire cities, what other certainties might prove to be illusions? This question influenced Roman approaches to everything from military planning to economic policy, introducing new levels of caution and contingency planning into imperial administration. Pliny's scientific legacy. Pliny the Younger's letters about the eruption deserve special recognition as perhaps the first true scientific documents in Western literature. Unlike previous accounts of natural disasters, which typically focus on their supernatural significance or their political implications, Pliny's letters attempted to describe and analyze the physical processes involved in the eruption. His account of the eruption's visual characteristics, the pine tree-shaped cloud, the sequence of different types of ashfall, the behavior of the sea during the disaster, provided future natural philosophers with detailed data about volcanic processes. More importantly, his approach demonstrated the value of careful observation and systematic recording of natural phenomena. I believe my uncle would have wanted his death to contribute to human knowledge. Pliny wrote in his most famous letter to Tacitus. He died seeking to understand what he was witnessing. I have tried to honor that quest by recording not what I believe should have happened, or what will make the best story, but what I actually observed with my own eyes. This commitment to factual accuracy over literary effect marked a departure from traditional Roman approaches to writing about disasters. Previous accounts had typically emphasized the moral lessons to be drawn from such events or their significance as omens of political change. Pliny focused instead on the physical reality of what occurred. His detailed descriptions of the different types of volcanic material, the progression of the eruption through distinct phases, and the varying effects on different locations provided later scholars with data that remained useful for centuries. When Mount Vesuvius erupted again in later centuries, natural philosophers could compare those events with Pliny's account to identify common patterns and develop better understanding of volcanic processes. The letters also established important principles for scientific observation. Pliny emphasized the importance of multiple witnesses, the need to distinguish between direct observation and hearsay, and the value of precise timing and measurement. These principles would eventually become fundamental elements of scientific method. Perhaps most importantly, Pliny's work demonstrated that natural disasters could be studied and understood through human reason rather than simply accepted as incomprehensible divine judgments. This represented a crucial step in the development of natural science as a distinct field of human inquiry. The memory of the worst day. As the immediate crisis faded and the buried cities were gradually forgotten by all but local inhabitants, the memory of August 24th, 79 CE, was preserved primarily through Pliny's letters and the account of other survivors. But this memory served a purpose beyond mere historical record. It became a touchstone for Roman thinking about vulnerability, preparation, and the limits of human control. The disaster entered Roman consciousness as a symbol of the ultimate fragility of human achievement. No matter how grand the buildings, how advanced the engineering, how powerful the military, nature retained the ability to erase it all without warning. This awareness influenced Roman policy and planning for generations. Military commanders began to include natural disasters in their strategic planning, recognizing that earthquakes, floods, or volcanic eruptions could be as decisive as enemy armies in determining the outcome of campaigns. Economic planners developed more diversified approaches to trade and agriculture, seeking to avoid the kind of regional concentration that had made Campania's destruction so economically devastating. The memory also influenced Roman approaches to religion and philosophy. The traditional Roman confidence in the ability to maintain divine favor through proper rituals and offerings was tempered by the recognition that some forces operated beyond the reach of human influence. This led to more nuanced theological thinking and a greater emphasis on preparing for the worst while hoping for the best. Vesuvius taught us that we live in a world where the ground beneath our feet may betray us without warning, wrote Marcus Aurelius in his Meditations, written nearly a century after the eruption. This knowledge need not paralyze us with fear, but it should inspire us to value each day, to treat each other with greater kindness, and to build not just for permanence but for meaning. The disaster's memory was kept alive through more than just written accounts. Artists throughout the empire created works depicting the eruption and its aftermath, often emphasizing themes of human heroism in the face of natural catastrophe. These artistic works, displayed in public buildings throughout the empire, serve as constant reminders of both human vulnerability and human resilience. The technical knowledge gained from studying the disaster was preserved in engineering manuals and architectural treatises that were copied and distributed throughout the empire. These practical documents ensured that the lessons learned from Pompeii and Herculaneum would influence construction and planning in regions far from Vesuvius. Perhaps most importantly, the memory of Vesuvius established a new Roman awareness of the need for preparedness. The disaster had caught the region almost completely unprepared, with no evacuation plans, no emergency supplies, and no organized response to natural catastrophe. Future generations would not make the same mistake. Within decades of the eruption, major cities throughout the empire had developed disaster response protocols, maintained emergency supplies, and trained personnel in evacuation procedures. The Roman military added disaster response to its regular training, ensuring that legions could quickly mobilize to assist civilian populations during natural emergencies. The eruption of Mount Vesuvius on August 24th, 79 CE, thus became more than just a date marking a terrible natural disaster. It became the moment when Roman civilization matured from confident adolescence to wary adulthood, gaining wisdom about the natural world that would influence human thought and planning for centuries to come. In destroying Pompeii and Herculaneum, the mountain inadvertently taught lessons that would save countless lives in future disasters, making the worst day in the ancient world also, paradoxically, one of its most instructive.